I am Camille, 35 years old, and less than 4 hours ago I watched them lower my husband into the cold earth at Arlington National Cemetery. Isaiah was 45 years old, a retired Army colonel who took his military discipline and built one of the most successful government contracting logistics firms in Washington, D.C. He was my rock, my partner, and the love of my life. We had spent the last 7 years building a beautiful life together, merging my relentless drive as a corporate auditor with his brilliant strategic mind. But grief is a luxury I was not allowed to experience. Before the dirt had even settled over his casket, the vultures in his family swooped in to pick his legacy clean. I was standing in the center of my own dining room, still wearing my black mourning dress. The house was filled with the quiet murmur of politicians, military brass, and high society guests attending the repast. I was staring blankly at a catered tray of food I could not stomach when my mother-in-law, Geraldine, marched right up to me. She was the self-proclaimed matriarch of the city's African-American elite circles, a woman who cared more about her country club status than her own sons. She did not offer a hug. She did not ask how I was holding up. Instead, she dropped an open, velvet-lined box directly onto my dining table. The heavy thud silenced the conversations immediately around us. "Put Isaiah's Rolex, the keys to the Mercedes, and the corporate security fobs in here," Camille Geraldine commanded. Her voice was not a whisper. It was a sharp carrying tone designed to establish dominance. "You have played the grieving widow long enough today. The family is stepping in to manage his estate now." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to greedy relatives who tried to take what was rightfully yours. I stared at the velvet box, the sheer audacity of her demand freezing the breath in my lungs. Isaiah's Rolex was not just a watch. It was his retirement gift to himself after 20 years of serving this country. The corporate fobs she was demanding controlled access to a defense firm that held highly classified government contracts. And she wanted me to just drop them into a jewelry box between the potato salad and the dinner rolls. Before I could even formulate a response, Trevon flanked his mother. Trevon was Isaiah's younger brother, a man who possessed none of Isaiah's work ethic, but demanded all of the rewards. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit that I knew for a fact he had charged to Isaiah's account 3 months ago. He crossed his arms, looking down his nose at me with a smirk that made my blood boil. "Listen to our mother," Camille Trevon sneered, stepping aggressively into my personal space. "Let us be realistic here. You were just a spreadsheet cruncher doing basic audits before my brother rescued you. You do not have the pedigree, the connections, or the bloodline to handle a defense firm of this magnitude. Hand over the access. You are out of your depth." I took a slow, measured breath, refusing to let them see me break. Growing up working class and fighting my way to a finance degree at Howard University had taught me how to handle people who thought they were inherently better than me. I knew their game. In their eyes, because I did not come from their generational wealth, because my parents worked blue-collar jobs instead of attending elite galas, I was an outsider. I was just the hired help Isaiah had inexplicably married. The disrespect did not stop with Trevon. Standing just a few feet away was Meredith Trevon's white wife. She had spent the last 5 years using passive-aggressive elitism and racial microaggressions to try and put me in my place. She took a slow sip of her red wine, leaned over to a state senator's wife standing nearby, and spoke in a stage whisper intentionally calibrated for me to hear. "It really is so tragic." Meredith sighed dramatically, her eyes fixed on me. "Isaiah only married her out of charity. She is from such a rough working-class background. It was a total pity project for him. The family always knew she never truly belonged in our circles. It is a shame she is making this so difficult for Geraldine." My hands curled into tight fists at my sides. My husband had died of a sudden massive heart attack just 3 days ago. My heart was shattered into a million pieces. The man who had been my partner, my best friend, and my protector was gone. And here they were treating his death like a hostile corporate takeover, using my background as a weapon to strip away my legitimacy. I looked at Meredith, whose family wealth came from generational privilege, and then at Trevon and Geraldine, whose wealth came entirely from leeching off Isaiah's hard work. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream. I spoke with the icy calculated precision that made me a top-tier chief financial officer. "I am not giving you anything, Geraldine," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the now silent dining room. "I am his legal wife. I am the CFO of the logistics firm, and this is my home. You are a guest here today, out of respect for the man we just buried. Do not mistake my grief for weakness. I suggest you close that box and step away from my table." Geraldine's perfectly contoured face twisted into a mask of pure fury. She was not used to being defied, especially not by someone she considered beneath her station. She opened her mouth to launch another verbal assault, but Trevon cut her off with a dark, triumphant laugh. He reached into the breast pocket of his expensive jacket. He did not look angry. He looked like a predator who had just cornered his prey. "That is exactly the kind of arrogance Isaiah warned us about," Trevon said loudly, ensuring every high-ranking guest in the room was paying attention. He pulled out a thick, folded document bound with a heavy legal seal. He waved it in the air between us like a victory flag. "Actually," Camille Trevon said, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction, "you are not in charge of anything. Isaiah finally saw you for what you really are. He signed a new will 2 weeks before his heart attack." He tossed the document onto the table right next to the empty velvet box. The heavy paper slapped against the wood. "My brother woke up and realized his empire belongs to his real family," Trevon sneered, leaning in close so I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "He left the company, the liquid assets, and this very house to his bloodline. He left it to us, not to you, not—" The air in my dining room seemed to evaporate. The surrounding guests, people Isaiah had commanded troops with, people he had built multi-million-dollar contracts with, stood frozen in uncomfortable silence. I stared down at the thick legal document resting on my table. The seal of a prominent downtown law firm was pressed into the heavy paper. My name was nowhere on the visible cover page. Meredith took another sip of her wine, her eyes gleaming with malicious joy. "You should probably start packing, sweetie," she chimed in, her tone full of fake sympathy. "I hear the rental market is terrible right now, but maybe you can find a nice little apartment back in your old neighborhood." I felt a cold sweat break out across the back of my neck. Isaiah and I had drafted our wills together 5 years ago, leaving everything to each other. Our marriage had been solid. We had spent our final weeks together planning a vacation. There were no arguments, no secrets, no sudden rifts that would prompt him to disinherit me. He would never have betrayed me like this. He would never have handed the company we built together over to a mother who only cared about her social standing and a brother who could not even balance his own checkbook. "This is a forgery," I stated flatly, looking Trevon dead in the eye. "Isaiah would never sign this." Geraldine stepped forward, her posture rigid with triumph. "It is fully notarized, filed, and ironclad, Camille." My son realized his mistake before it was too late. "You are nothing but a squatter in our family home now. The locks to the corporate offices are being changed as we speak. You have no power here anymore." I stood alone in the center of the room that I had decorated with my husband, surrounded by the life we had built, as the people who shared his blood actively tried to erase my entire existence. The grief of losing him collided violently with the terrifying reality of what was happening. They were trying to leave me with absolutely nothing. But as I looked at the smug, victorious smiles on their faces, the initial shock in my chest began to harden into something entirely different. It hardened into absolute resolve. Passed away, my mother-in-law looked me in the eye and demanded everything he left behind. The house, the business, every single asset. My attorney urged me to fight her. Instead, I shook my head and told him to let her take it all. The entire courtroom thought I had lost my mind. At the final hearing, I signed every document while she smiled like she had already won the lottery. Then the judge closed the file, looked directly at her attorney, and asked one single question that destroyed her entire life. "Before I tell you how I brought down Washington, D.C.'s most toxic socialite, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart greedy relatives who tried to take what was rightfully yours." I am Camille. 35 years old and less than 4 hours ago, I watched an honor guard fold the American flag over the casket of my husband Isaiah. He was 45 years old, a man who took his military discipline and built one of the most successful government contracting logistics firms in the capital. He was my rock, my partner, and the absolute love of my life. We had spent the last 7 years building a beautiful empire together, merging my relentless drive as a corporate auditor with his brilliant strategic mind. But grief is a luxury I was not allowed to experience. Before the dirt had even settled over his grave, the vultures in his family swooped in to pick his legacy clean. I was standing in the center of my own dining room, still wearing my black morning dress. The house was filled with the quiet murmur of politicians, military brass, and high society guests attending the repast. I was staring blankly at a catered tray of food I could not stomach when my mother-in-law, Geraldine, marched right up to me. She was the self-proclaimed matriarch of the city's African-American elite circles, a woman who cared more about her country club status than the actual well-being of her own sons. She did not offer a hug. She did not ask how I was holding up. Instead, she dropped an open velvet-lined box directly onto my dining table. The heavy thud silenced the conversations immediately around us. "Put Isaiah's Rolex, the keys to the Mercedes, and the corporate security fobs in here," Camille Geraldine commanded. Her voice was not a whisper. It was a sharp, carrying tone designed to establish absolute dominance. "You have played the grieving widow long enough today. The family is stepping in to manage his estate now." I stared at the velvet box, the sheer audacity of her demand freezing the breath in my lungs. Isaiah's Rolex was not just a watch. It was his retirement gift to himself after 20 years of serving this country. The corporate fobs she was demanding controlled access to a defense firm that held highly classified government contracts. And she wanted me to just drop them into a jewelry box between the potato salad and the dinner rolls. Before I could even formulate a response, Trayvon flanked his mother. Trayvon was Isaiah's younger brother, a man who possessed none of Isaiah's work ethic, but demanded all of the rewards. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit that I knew for a fact he had charged to Isaiah's corporate account 3 months ago. He crossed his arms, looking down his nose at me with a smirk that made my blood boil. "Listen to our mother, Camille," Trayvon sneered, stepping aggressively into my personal space. "Let us be realistic here. You were just a spreadsheet cruncher doing basic audits before my brother rescued you. You do not have the pedigree, the connections, or the bloodline to handle a defense firm of this magnitude. Hand over the access. You are way out of your depth." I took a slow, measured breath, refusing to let them see me break. Growing up working class and fighting my way to a finance degree at Howard University had taught me exactly how to handle people who thought they were inherently better than me. I knew their game. In their eyes, because I did not come from their generational wealth, because my parents worked blue-collar jobs instead of attending elite galas, I was an outsider. I was just the hired help Isaiah had inexplicably married. The disrespect did not stop with Trayvon. Standing just a few feet away was Meredith, Trayvon's white wife. She had spent the last 5 years using passive-aggressive elitism and racial microaggressions to try and put me in my place. She took a slow sip of her red wine, leaned over to a state senator's wife standing nearby, and spoke in a stage whisper intentionally calibrated for me to hear. "It really is so tragic." Meredith sighed dramatically, her eyes fixed on me. "Isaiah only married her out of charity. She is from such a rough working-class background. It was a total pity project for him. The family always knew she never truly belonged in our circles. It is a shame she is making this so difficult for Geraldine today." My hands curled into tight fists at my sides. My husband had died of a sudden massive heart attack just 3 days ago. My heart was shattered into a million pieces. The man who had been my partner, my best friend, and my protector was gone. And here they were treating his death like a hostile corporate takeover, using my background as a weapon to strip away my legitimacy. I looked at Meredith, whose family wealth came from generational privilege, and then at Trayvon and Geraldine, whose wealth came entirely from leeching off Isaiah's hard work. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream. I spoke with the icy, calculated precision that made me a top-tier chief financial officer. "I am not giving you anything, Geraldine," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the now silent dining room. "I am his legal wife. I am the CFO of the logistics firm, and this is my home. You are a guest here today out of respect for the man we just buried. Do not mistake my grief for weakness. I suggest you close that box and step away from my table." Geraldine's perfectly contoured face twisted into a mask of pure fury. She was not used to being defied, especially not by someone she considered beneath her station. She opened her mouth to launch another verbal assault, but Trayvon cut her off with a dark, triumphant laugh. He reached into the breast pocket of his expensive jacket. He did not look angry. He looked like a predator who had just cornered his prey. "That is exactly the kind of arrogance Isaiah warned us about," Trayvon said loudly, ensuring every high-ranking guest in the room was paying attention. He pulled out a thick, folded document bound with a heavy legal seal. He waved it in the air between us like a victory flag. "Actually, Camille," Trayvon said, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction, "you are not in charge of anything. Isaiah finally saw you for what you really are. He signed a new will 2 weeks before his heart attack." He tossed the document onto the table right next to the empty velvet box. The heavy paper slapped against the wood. "My brother woke up and realized his empire belongs to his real family," Trayvon sneered, leaning in close so I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "He left the company, the liquid assets, and this very house to his bloodline. He left it to us, not to you, not—" The air in my dining room seemed to evaporate. The surrounding guest people Isaiah had commanded troops with, people he had built multi-million-dollar contracts with, stood frozen in uncomfortable silence. I stared down at the thick legal document resting on my table. The seal of a prominent downtown law firm was pressed into the heavy paper. My name was nowhere on the visible cover page. Meredith took another sip of her wine, her eyes gleaming with malicious joy. "You should probably start packing, sweetie," she chimed in, her tone full of fake sympathy. "I hear the rental market is terrible right now, but maybe you can find a nice little apartment back in your old neighborhood." I felt a cold sweat break out across the back of my neck. Isaiah and I had drafted our wills together 5 years ago, leaving everything to each other. Our marriage had been solid. We had spent our final weeks together planning a vacation. There were no arguments, no secrets, no sudden rifts that would prompt him to disinherit me. He would never have betrayed me like this. He would never have handed the company we built together over to a mother who only cared about her social standing and a brother who could not even balance his own checkbook. "This is a forgery," I stated flatly. Looking Trayvon dead in the eye, "Isaiah would never sign this." Geraldine stepped forward, her posture rigid with triumph. "It is fully notarized, filed, and ironclad. Camille, my son realized his mistake before it was too late. You are nothing but a squatter in our family home now. The locks to the corporate offices are being changed as we speak. You have no power here anymore." I stood alone in the center of the room that I had decorated with my husband, surrounded by the life we had built as the people who shared his blood actively tried to erase my entire existence. The grief of losing him collided violently with the terrifying reality of what was happening. They were trying to leave me with absolutely nothing. I barely slept that night. The house felt cavernous and empty, without Isaiah's deep voice echoing down the halls. I spent the hours pacing the hardwood floors, turning the events of the repast over in my mind. Trayvon and Geraldine had moved too fast. You do not produce a brand new notarized will mere hours after a funeral, unless you have been planning a coup for weeks. I knew the logistics firm inside and out. I handled the audits, the payroll, the tax liabilities. There was no way I was going to let them strip away everything we had built. The next morning, I dressed in my sharpest navy blue suit, pinned my Howard University alumni pin to my lapel, and drove straight to the firm's headquarters in Arlington. I needed to access my office, secure my personal files, and lock down the financial servers before Trayvon could get his hands on the routing numbers. I walked up to the sleek glass doors of the building, pulled out my executive access badge, and tapped it against the scanner. A sharp red light blinked back at me. Access denied. I tried again. Denied. A heavy knot formed in my stomach. I pushed past the turnstile and walked into the main lobby. The sight that greeted me made my blood run cold. Sitting behind the massive marble executive reception desk, occupying the seat of the lead administrative assistant, was Meredith. She was wearing a designer blazer, tapping away on a keyboard as if she owned the entire building. Two large security guards stood awkwardly near the elevators, looking nervous. "Can I help you, ma'am?" Meredith asked, her voice laced with mock professionalism. She did not even look up from the screen at first. Then she slowly raised her eyes, feigning surprise. "Oh, Camille, I am afraid visitors need an appointment." "Turn my badge back on, Meredith," I demanded, walking straight up to the desk. "This is not a game. I have payroll to authorize by noon." Meredith smiled, a thin, cruel stretching of her lips. She leaned back in the expensive ergonomic chair and picked up a manicured file folder. "Trayvon is the acting CEO now, Camille. He deactivated your credentials at midnight. The company does not employ you anymore. In fact, you are trespassing on private property." She turned to the security guards. "Gentlemen, please escort this unauthorized visitor off the premises." The guards hesitated. They were men Isaiah and I had hired, personally, veterans who knew exactly who I was. I turned to them, my posture radiating absolute authority. "I am still a 50% shareholder until the probate court rules. Otherwise," I told the guards, keeping my voice dangerously calm, "if either of you lays a hand on me, my attorney will have your security licenses permanently revoked by sundown." The guards immediately stepped back, lowering their heads. They knew better than to cross me. I did not wait for Meredith to utter another word. I bypassed the desk and marched straight toward the private elevators, swiping my emergency manual override key to access the top floor. Meredith shouted something behind me, scrambling to pick up the phone, but I was already gone. I stepped off the elevator onto the executive floor and headed straight for Isaiah's corner office. The heavy oak doors were wide open. I stepped inside and stopped dead in my tracks. Trayvon and Geraldine were sitting on the expensive leather sofas, laughing. It was barely 9 in the morning, and they were already drinking Isaiah's private reserve scotch. Trayvon had his feet propped up on Isaiah's mahogany desk, holding a crystal glass like a king surveying his newly conquered kingdom. "What part of you are fired did you not understand?" Trayvon snapped, dropping his feet from the desk as I walked in. He did not look intimidated. He looked thrilled. I ignored him, my eyes sweeping the room to see what they had touched, what they had moved. "You cannot fire an owner," Trayvon, I stated, "and you cannot steal a company with a piece of paper you printed off the internet." Trayvon chuckled darkly. He stood up, walked around the desk, and pulled a certified legal document from a manila folder. He shoved it directly into my chest. I grabbed it before it fell. "Read it and weep, spreadsheet cruncher," Trayvon mocked. "That is a preliminary court injunction. We had an emergency hearing at 8 this morning with a judge who plays golf with our legal team. The court has officially frozen all your corporate assets and authorized me as the sole executor of the estate pending the final probate hearing. You cannot touch a single dime. You cannot authorize a single transfer. You are locked out, Camille." I scanned the document. It was real. A judge had actually signed a temporary freeze based on the forged will pending a full investigation. They had used their high society connections to fast-track an injunction, leaving me financially paralyzed. Meredith walked into the office behind me, breathless from running up the stairs. "I told you she barged past security," Meredith complained to Geraldine. She walked up and stood next to her husband, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. "You should really just give up, Camille." Meredith sneered. "Take whatever pennies are left in your personal checking account and go back to doing taxes for mom and pop shops. You tried to play in the big leagues, but you just do not have what it takes to survive in our world. Leave the keys on the desk and walk out with whatever dignity you have left." They stared at me, a unified front of greed and entitlement. They expected me to scream. They expected me to cry, to beg, to break down, and show them the defeated working-class girl they always believed I was. Instead, I smiled. It was a cold, empty smile that made Geraldine shift uncomfortably on the sofa. I did not say a word. I turned my back on them and walked purposefully toward the large oil painting hanging on the far wall of the office. I reached behind the heavy frame and pulled it open, revealing the reinforced steel of Isaiah's private wall safe. Trayvon lunged forward. "Hey, step away from that. That belongs to the estate." I ignored him. I placed my thumb flat against the biometric scanner. The system beeped, a green light flashed, and the heavy steel door clicked open. Trayvon stopped in his tracks, his eyes widening with greedy anticipation. I knew exactly what he was hoping to see. He wanted the emergency cash reserves, the bearer bonds, the offshore account tokens. I reached into the safe and deliberately bypassed the top shelf where the cash was kept. I reached down to the bottom and pulled out a heavy, battered olive green military footlocker. It was rusted at the hinges and completely unassuming. Geraldine let out a loud, mocking laugh from the sofa. "Are you kidding me?" she scoffed. "We are taking control of a $20 million empire and you are breaking into a safe to steal a box of sentimental junk. Take his old army medals, Camille. God knows you will need something to sell to make rent next month." I held the heavy footlocker against my chest. I did not look at the cash. I did not look at the corporate checkbooks. I turned around, walked right past Meredith's triumphant smirk, and headed straight for the elevator. "Let her go!" Trevon laughed, calling out from the office. "Let her take the garbage. The throne is mine now." I rode the elevator down in absolute silence, walked out of the building, and placed the olive green box into the trunk of my car. I got into the driver's seat and locked the doors. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. I reached over and cracked the heavy latch on the footlocker. Inside, there were no medals. There were no sentimental letters or old photographs. Resting at the bottom of the box was a heavy-duty encrypted external hard drive. Attached to the top of it was a bright yellow sticky note written in Isaiah's unmistakable, hurried handwriting. The note read, "If Trayvon tries to take the crown, let him wear it." I stared at the hard drive, my heart pounding a fierce rhythm against my ribs. Trayvon and Geraldine thought they had just executed the perfect corporate heist. They thought they had outsmarted the poor girl from the wrong side of the tracks. They had absolutely no idea that they had just walked willingly into a trap. After my husband passed away, my mother-in-law cornered me in my own dining room and demanded everything he left behind. She wanted the house, the multi-million-dollar family business, and every single asset to her name. My attorney urged me to fight her with everything I had. Instead, I shook my head and told him to let her take it all. The entire courtroom thought I had lost my mind. At the final hearing, I signed every document handing over the empire while she smiled like she had already won the lottery. Then the judge closed the file, looked directly at her attorney, and asked one single question that destroyed her entire life. Before I tell you how I brought down Washington, D.C.'s most toxic socialite, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart greedy relatives who tried to take what was rightfully yours. I am Camille, 35 years old, and less than 4 hours ago, I watched an honor guard fold the American flag over the casket of my husband Isaiah. He was 45 years old, a man who took his military discipline and built one of the most successful government contracting logistics firms in the capital. He was my rock, my partner, and the absolute love of my life. We had spent the last 7 years building a beautiful empire together, merging my relentless drive as a corporate auditor with his brilliant strategic mind. But grief is a luxury I was not allowed to experience. Before the dirt had even settled over his grave at Arlington National Cemetery, the vultures in his family swooped in to pick his legacy clean. I was standing in the center of my own dining room, still wearing my black mourning dress. The house was filled with the quiet murmur of politicians, military brass, and high society guests attending the repast. I was staring blankly at a catered tray of food I could not stomach when my mother-in-law, Geraldine, marched right up to me. She was the self-proclaimed matriarch of the city's African-American elite circles, a woman who cared more about her country club status than the actual well-being of her own sons. She did not offer a hug. She did not ask how I was holding up. Instead, she dropped an open velvet-lined box directly onto my dining table. The heavy thud silenced the conversations immediately around us. Put Isaiah's Rolex, the keys to the Mercedes, and the corporate security fobs in here, Camille Geraldine commanded. Her voice was not a whisper. It was a sharp, carrying tone designed to establish absolute dominance. You have played the grieving widow long enough today. The family is stepping in to manage his estate now. I stared at the velvet box, the sheer audacity of her demand freezing the breath in my lungs. Isaiah's Rolex was not just a watch. It was his retirement gift to himself after 20 years of serving this country. The corporate fobs she was demanding controlled access to a defense firm that held highly classified government contracts, and she wanted me to just drop them into a jewelry box between the potato salad and the dinner rolls. Before I could even formulate a response, Traven flanked his mother. Traven was Isaiah's younger brother, a man who possessed none of Isaiah's work ethic, but demanded all of the rewards. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit that I knew for a fact he had charged to Isaiah's corporate account 3 months ago. He crossed his arms, looking down his nose at me with a smirk that made my blood boil. Listen to our mother, Camille Trevon sneered, stepping aggressively into my personal space. Let us be realistic here. You were just a spreadsheet cruncher doing basic audits before my brother rescued you. You do not have the pedigree, the connections, or the bloodline to handle a defense firm of this magnitude. Hand over the access. You are way out of your depth. I took a slow, measured breath, refusing to let them see me break. Growing up working class and fighting my way to a finance degree at Howard University had taught me exactly how to handle people who thought they were inherently better than me. I knew their game. In their eyes, because I did not come from their generational wealth, because my parents worked blue-collar jobs instead of attending elite galas, I was an outsider. I was just the hired help Isaiah had inexplicably married. The disrespect did not stop with Trevon. Standing just a few feet away was Meredith Trevon's white wife. She had spent the last 5 years using passive-aggressive elitism and racial microaggressions to try and put me in my place. She took a slow sip of her red wine, leaned over to a state senator's wife standing nearby, and spoke in a stage whisper intentionally calibrated for me to hear. It really is so tragic. Meredith sighed dramatically, her eyes fixed on me. Isaiah only married her out of charity. She is from such a rough working-class background. It was a total pity project for him. The family always knew she never truly belonged in our circles. It is a shame she is making this so difficult for Geraldine today. My hands curled into tight fists at my sides. My husband had died of a sudden massive heart attack just 3 days ago. My heart was shattered into a million pieces. The man who had been my partner, my best friend, and my protector was gone. And here they were, treating his death like a hostile corporate takeover, using my background as a weapon to strip away my legitimacy. I looked at Meredith, whose family wealth came from generational privilege, and then at Trevon and Geraldine, whose wealth came entirely from leeching off Isaiah's hard work. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream. I spoke with the icy calculated precision that made me a top-tier chief financial officer. I am not giving you anything, Geraldine. I said, my voice echoing clearly in the now silent dining room. I am his legal wife. I am the CFO of the logistics firm. And this is my home. You are a guest here today out of respect for the man we just buried. Do not mistake my grief for weakness. I suggest you close that box and step away from my table. Geraldine's perfectly contoured face twisted into a mask of pure fury. She was not used to being defied, especially not by someone she considered beneath her station. She opened her mouth to launch another verbal assault, but Trevon cut her off with a dark, triumphant laugh. He reached into the breast pocket of his expensive jacket. He did not look angry. He looked like a predator who had just cornered his prey. That is exactly the kind of arrogance Isaiah warned us about, Trevon said loudly, ensuring every high-ranking guest in the room was paying attention. He pulled out a thick folded document bound with a heavy legal seal. He waved it in the air between us like a victory flag. Actually, Camille Trevon said, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. You are not in charge of anything. Isaiah finally saw you for what you really are. He signed a new will 2 weeks before his heart attack. He tossed the document onto the table right next to the empty velvet box. the heavy paper slapped against the wood. My brother woke up and realized his empire belongs to his real family. Trevon sneered, leaning in close so I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. He left the company, the liquid assets, and this very house to his bloodline. He left it to us, not to you. The air in my dining room seemed to evaporate. The surrounding guests, people Isaiah had commanded troops, with people he had built multi-million-dollar contracts with, stood frozen in uncomfortable silence. I stared down at the thick legal document resting on my table. The seal of a prominent downtown law firm was pressed into the heavy paper. My name was nowhere on the visible cover page. Meredith took another sip of her wine, her eyes gleaming with malicious joy. "You should probably start packing, sweetie," she chimed in her tone, full of fake sympathy. "I hear the rental market is terrible right now, but maybe you can find a nice little apartment back in your old neighborhood." I felt a cold sweat break out across the back of my neck. Isaiah and I had drafted our wills together 5 years ago, leaving everything to each other. Our marriage had been solid. We had spent our final weeks together planning a vacation. There were no arguments, no secrets, no sudden rifts that would prompt him to disinherit me. He would never have betrayed me like this. He would never have handed the company we built together over to a mother who only cared about her social standing and a brother who could not even balance his own checkbook. "This is a forgery," I stated flatly, looking Trevon dead in the eye. "Isaiah would never sign this." Geraldine stepped forward, her posture rigid with triumph. "It is fully notarized, filed, and ironclad." "Camille, my son realized his mistake before it was too late. You are nothing but a squatter in our family home now. The locks to the corporate offices are being changed as we speak. You have no power here anymore." I stood alone in the center of the room that I had decorated with my husband, surrounded by the life we had built, as the people who shared his blood actively tried to erase my entire existence. The grief of losing him collided violently with the terrifying reality of what was happening. They were trying to leave me with absolutely nothing. But as I looked at the smug, victorious smiles on their faces, the initial shock in my chest began to harden into something entirely different. It hardened into absolute resolve. I barely slept that night. The house felt cavernous and empty without Isaiah's deep voice echoing down the halls. I spent the hours pacing the hardwood floors, turning the events of the repast over in my mind. Trevon and Geraldine had moved too fast. You do not produce a brand new notarized will mere hours after a funeral unless you have been planning a coup for weeks. I knew the logistics firm inside and out. I handled the audits, the payroll, the tax liabilities. There was no way I was going to let them strip away everything we had built. The next morning, I dressed in my sharpest navy blue suit, pinned my Howard University alumni pin to my lapel, and drove straight to the firm's headquarters in Arlington. I needed to access my office, secure my personal files, and lock down the financial servers before Trevon could get his hands on the routing numbers. I walked up to the sleek glass doors of the building, pulled out my executive access badge, and tapped it against the scanner. A sharp red light blinked back at me. Access denied. I tried again. Denied. A heavy knot formed in my stomach. I pushed past the turnstile and walked into the main lobby. The sight that greeted me made my blood run cold. Sitting behind the massive marble executive reception desk occupying the seat of the lead administrative assistant was Meredith. She was wearing a designer blazer, tapping away on a keyboard as if she owned the entire building. 2 large security guards stood awkwardly near the elevators, looking nervous. "Can I help you, ma'am?" Meredith asked, her voice laced with mock professionalism. She did not even look up from the screen at first. Then she slowly raised her eyes, feigning surprise. "Oh, Camille, I am afraid visitors need an appointment." "Turn my badge back on Meredith," I demanded, walking straight up to the desk. "This is not a game. I have payroll to authorize by noon." Meredith smiled, a thin, cruel stretching of her lips. She leaned back in the expensive ergonomic chair and picked up a manicured file folder. "Trevon is the acting CEO, now Camille. He deactivated your credentials at midnight. The company does not employ you anymore. In fact, you are trespassing on private property." She turned to the security guards. Gentlemen, please escort this unauthorized visitor off the premises. The guards hesitated. They were men Isaiah and I had hired personally, veterans who knew exactly who I was. I turned to them, my posture radiating absolute authority. I am still a 50% shareholder until the probate court rules. Otherwise, I told the guards, keeping my voice dangerously calm. If either of you lays a hand on me, my attorney will have your security licenses permanently revoked by sundown. The guards immediately stepped back, lowering their heads. They knew better than to cross me. I did not wait for Meredith to utter another word. I bypassed the desk and marched straight toward the private elevators, swiping my emergency manual override key to access the top floor. Meredith shouted something behind me, scrambling to pick up the phone, but I was already gone. I stepped off the elevator onto the executive floor and headed straight for Isaiah's corner office. The heavy oak doors were wide open. I stepped inside and stopped dead in my tracks. Trayvon and Geraldine were sitting on the expensive leather sofas, laughing. It was barely 9 in the morning, and they were already drinking Isaiah's private reserve scotch. Trayvon had his feet propped up on Isaiah's mahogany desk, holding a crystal glass like a king surveying his newly conquered kingdom. "What part of you are fired did you not understand?" Trayvon snapped, dropping his feet from the desk as I walked in. He did not look intimidated. He looked thrilled. I ignored him, my eyes sweeping the room to see what they had touched, what they had moved. "You cannot fire an owner, Trayvon," I stated. "And you cannot steal a company with a piece of paper you printed off the internet." Trayvon chuckled darkly. He stood up, walked around the desk, and pulled a certified legal document from a manila folder. He shoved it directly into my chest. I grabbed it before it fell. "Read it and weep, spreadsheet cruncher," Trayvon mocked. "That is a preliminary court injunction. We had an emergency hearing at 8 this morning with a judge who plays golf with our legal team. The court has officially frozen all your corporate assets and authorized me as the sole executor of the estate, pending the final probate hearing. You cannot touch a single dime. You cannot authorize a single transfer. You are locked out, Camille." I scanned the document. It was real. A judge had actually signed a temporary freeze based on the forged will pending a full investigation. They had used their high society connections to fast-track an injunction, leaving me financially paralyzed. Meredith walked into the office behind me, breathless from running up the stairs. "I told you she barged past security," Meredith complained to Geraldine. She walked up and stood next to her husband, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. "You should really just give up, Camille," Meredith sneered. "Take whatever pennies are left in your personal checking account and go back to doing taxes for mom and pop shops. You tried to play in the big leagues, but you just do not have what it takes to survive in our world. Leave the keys on the desk and walk out with whatever dignity you have left." They stared at me, a unified front of greed and entitlement. They expected me to scream. They expected me to cry, to beg, to break down and show them the defeated working-class girl they always believed I was. Instead, I smiled. It was a cold, empty smile that made Geraldine shift uncomfortably on the sofa. I did not say a word. I turned my back on them and walked purposefully toward the large oil painting hanging on the far wall of the office. I reached behind the heavy frame and pulled it open, revealing the reinforced steel of Isaiah's private biometric wall safe. Trayvon lunged forward the second he realized what I was doing. He scrambled around the massive mahogany desk, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the polished hardwood floor. "Hey, step away from that safe right now!" Trayvon shouted, his voice cracking with sudden panic. "Everything in this office belongs to the estate. You do not have the right to touch any of it." I did not even bother to turn around and look at him. I stood completely still, pressing my thumb firmly against the glass of the biometric scanner. Isaiah had insisted on installing this specific security system 3 years ago when he realized the defense contracts we were handling required absolute impenetrable protection. He had programmed his own thumbprint and mine. He had explicitly refused to give Trayvon or Geraldine any access, knowing exactly how reckless they were with money. The scanner emitted a soft beep. A tiny green light flashed across the digital display. A heavy mechanical click echoed through the room as the thick steel locking bolts retracted. Trayvon was practically breathing down my neck now, so close I could smell the sharp, expensive scent of the scotch he had been drinking all morning. Geraldine stood up from the leather sofa, her high heels clicking rapidly across the room as she hurried to join her son. They both crowded behind me, craning their necks like starving animals waiting for a cage to be opened. I pulled the heavy steel door open. The interior of the safe was massive, built directly into the reinforced structure of the building. I knew exactly what they were expecting to see. I knew exactly what they were salivating over. And as the door swung wide, the contents were revealed in the dim lighting of the security vault. On the top shelf, neatly stacked and banded with thick paper strips, was the company emergency cash reserve. There were hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting right there in plain sight. Next to the cash were thick leather binders containing the routing numbers for the offshore holding accounts, the bearer bonds, and the physical stock certificates that represented the liquid wealth of the logistics empire Isaiah had built from the ground up. I heard Traven let out a sharp, ragged gasp. He had never actually seen the inside of his brother's safe. He had always pretended he was a crucial part of this company, parading around Washington, D.C. like a wealthy executive, but he had always been kept strictly on the outside of the real financial operations. Seeing the tangible proof of Isaiah's wealth right in front of him made him completely lose his composure. He actually reached his hand out, his fingers trembling as he moved toward the stacks of $100 bills. "Do not even think about it, Trayvon," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous low octave. "The judge may have frozen my assets, but this cash is highly regulated corporate capital. If you touch a single bill without a documented audit trail, I will have federal investigators swarming this building before you can even make it to your car." Traven snatched his hand back as if the money had burned him. He glared at me, his face flushing with anger and embarrassment. "You cannot touch it either, Camille," he spat back, trying to regain his false sense of authority. "The injunction is absolute. Step away and leave the keys." I ignored his posturing. I had absolutely no intention of taking the cash. As a forensic accountant, I knew better than anyone that taking undocumented funds during a hostile probate dispute was professional suicide. I did not care about the money on the top shelf. I reached past the cash, past the bearer bonds, and past the leather binders. I reached down to the very bottom compartment of the safe. Resting in the dark corner, completely out of place among the pristine financial documents, was a heavy, battered olive green military footlocker. The paint was chipping at the corners. The metal latches were rusted and scuffed from years of being dragged across overseas military bases. It looked like garbage compared to the sleek, modern aesthetic of the executive office. I gripped the heavy canvas handle and dragged the footlocker out of the safe. It was incredibly heavy, but I held it firmly against my chest. Geraldine stared at the rusted metal box, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows pulling together in deep confusion. Then, as she realized I was ignoring the fortune on the top shelf to take an old, beat-up military box, she threw her head back and let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Are you actually kidding me right now?" Geraldine scoffed, the sound echoing harshly off the glass walls of the office. "We just legally stripped you of a $20 million empire. We locked you out of your own bank accounts, and you are breaking into a high-security vault to steal a box of sentimental junk." Meredith walked into the office just in time to catch the end of Geraldine's comment. She leaned against the doorframe, crossing her arms over her designer blouse, a cruel smile stretching across her face. "Oh, let her take it," Geraldine Meredith chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "She is probably going to need Isaiah's old army medals to pawn for rent money next month. You have to remember where she comes from. People like Camille are used to digging through the trash to find things to sell. It is just in her nature." They all laughed together, a unified chorus of elitism and absolute cruelty. They expected me to defend myself. They expected me to scream at them, to justify my actions, to fight back against their relentless insults. They wanted me to perform the role of the angry, emotional, defeated widow so they could feel powerful and validated in their theft. I did not give them a single ounce of satisfaction. I kept my face completely devoid of emotion. I closed the heavy steel door of the safe, ensuring it locked securely behind me. I held the cold, heavy metal of the footlocker against my chest, feeling the solid weight of it grounding me. "Enjoy the corner office, Trayvon," I said, my voice perfectly level. "It is a very heavy crown to wear." I turned my back on them. I did not look at the stacks of cash one last time. I did not look at the expensive mahogany desk where my husband used to sit. I walked straight past Meredith, not even acknowledging her presence as I moved through the doorway. "Let her go!" Trevon laughed, calling out from behind me. "Let her take the garbage. The throne is mine now." I walked down the long carpeted hallway of the executive floor. The silence was deafening. The employees who had arrived early were hiding in their cubicles, terrified of the drama unfolding in the corner office. I kept my head held high, my posture perfectly straight. I stepped into the private elevator, swiped my manual override key one last time, and rode the car down to the ground floor. I walked through the lobby past the two security guards who immediately averted their eyes. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the crisp morning air of Arlington. The sun was shining brightly, a stark contrast to the suffocating darkness I had just escaped inside that building. I walked to my car, my heels clicking rhythmically against the pavement. I opened the rear passenger door and carefully placed the olive green footlocker onto the leather seat. I shut the door, walked around to the driver's side, and slid behind the steering wheel. I locked the doors immediately. The moment I was completely alone, enclosed in the privacy of my vehicle, the adrenaline finally caught up with me. My hands began to shake uncontrollably. I gripped the steering wheel, taking deep, shuddering breaths to calm my racing heart. I had just walked away from my entire livelihood. I had just left my husband's legacy in the hands of the very people who had despised him for being more successful than them. But I knew Isaiah. I knew the man I had married better than anyone else in the world. Isaiah did not keep sentimental junk taking up valuable space in a high-security biometric safe. He was a master tactician, a man who planned 10 steps ahead of every enemy he ever faced. I reached over the center console and pulled the heavy footlocker onto the passenger seat. My fingers traced the rusted metal latches. I popped the left latch, then the right. The loud metallic snaps echoed in the quiet interior of the car. I pushed the heavy lid open. My breath caught in my throat. There were no faded photographs inside. There were no dusty military uniforms, no old love letters, no bronze medals from his tours overseas. The bottom of the footlocker was lined with thick, shock-absorbent foam. Resting perfectly in the center of the foam cutout was a heavy-duty military-grade, encrypted external hard drive. It was thick black and completely secure. Attached directly to the top of the hard drive was a bright yellow sticky note. The ink was slightly smudged, but the handwriting was hurried sharp and absolutely unmistakable. It was Isaiah's handwriting. I reached out with a trembling hand and peeled the sticky note off the hard drive. I read the words written on the small square of paper, my heart pounding a fierce, relentless rhythm against my ribs. The note read, "If Trevon tries to take the crown, let him wear it." I sat frozen in the driver's seat, staring at those 11 words until they blurred before my eyes. A chilling realization began to wash over me, replacing the overwhelming grief with a sudden sharp clarity. Trayvon and Geraldine thought they had just executed the perfect corporate heist. They thought they had successfully manipulated the legal system to strip me of my wealth. They thought they had outsmarted the poor working-class girl from the wrong side of the tracks. They had absolutely no idea that they had just walked, willingly, joyfully, into a massive, inescapable trap. Isaiah had known. Somehow, in his final days, my brilliant husband had known exactly what his greedy family would try to do the moment he was gone. He had not left me completely defenseless. He had left me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them. I carefully placed the sticky note back onto the hard drive. I closed the lid of the footlocker and secured the metal latches. I started the engine of my car, pulled out of the corporate parking lot, and merged onto the highway, heading straight toward downtown Washington, D.C. I needed to get to my attorney's office immediately. The mourning period was officially over. It was time to see exactly what kind of poison Isaiah had left behind for his brother to drink. I merged onto Interstate 395. My hands gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles ached. The heavy military hard drive sat perfectly still on the passenger seat, but it felt like it was radiating heat. The morning traffic of Washington, D.C. was a chaotic blur of dark sedans and flashing brake lights, but my mind was completely hyper-focused. Isaiah had known. In his final weeks, while his heart was quietly failing him, my brilliant husband had been fighting a silent war. He had uncovered a betrayal so deep he could not even tell me about it until he had gathered all the ammunition I would need to finish the fight. I navigated the crowded downtown streets and pulled into the underground parking garage of a sleek glass building on K Street. I grabbed the hard drive, stuffed it into my leather tote bag, and marched directly to the private elevator. I was heading to see Elias. Elias was a 60-year-old legal shark, a brilliant corporate litigator who had built his reputation destroying corrupt executives in federal court. He had advised Isaiah on his initial government defense contracts years ago, and he was one of the few men in the Capitol I trusted completely. I walked straight past his receptionist and pushed the heavy oak doors of his corner office open. Elias was standing by his window overlooking the Potomac River holding a cup of coffee. He took one look at my face, set his mug down, and walked over to lock his office door. I pulled the black military-grade hard drive from my bag and set it heavily onto the center of his glass desk. Elias looked at the drive, then looked at me. His expression was grim. He motioned for me to sit down, taking the leather chair across from me. He leaned forward and delivered the harsh, unapologetic reality of my situation. He explained that Trayvon and Geraldine had moved with terrifying speed. By securing an emergency injunction from a judge within their social circle, they had successfully weaponized the probate system against me. Elias warned me that fighting a forged will in a D.C. probate court was a bloody, exhausting process. Trayvon now had the entire financial weight of the logistics firm backing his legal team. I only had my private consulting funds. Elias told me that dragging this through litigation could take 5 long years, and by the end of it, the legal fees would completely drain my personal savings. He said they were hoping to starve me out financially until I surrendered. I listened to his warning without blinking. Then I pointed to the hard drive on his desk. "I am not going to fight them for the company, Elias," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "I just need you to open this drive." Elias sighed, pulled a secure, air-gapped laptop from his bottom drawer, and set it on the desk. This terminal was completely disconnected from any network designed specifically to review highly sensitive corporate data without leaving a digital footprint. He plugged the hard drive into the port. A black screen appeared with a blinking cursor demanding a decryption key. I leaned over the desk and typed in the complex 12-digit numerical sequence Isaiah and I used for our personal biometric safe at home. I hit enter. The screen went completely dark for a fraction of a second, and then a bright green light flashed. The drive unlocked. Dozens of high-density folders populated the screen. I immediately took control of the keyboard. This was my territory. I had spent the last decade tearing apart corporate financial structures, hunting down missing assets, and exposing financial discrepancies. I cracked my knuckles and dove into the data Isaiah had meticulously compiled. It took me less than 20 minutes to follow the money trail. I opened the main accounting ledgers and cross-referenced them against the shadow books Isaiah had hidden in a subfolder. I watched the numbers align, and a sickening feeling washed over me. Trayvon had not just been skimming petty cash from the corporate expense accounts to buy his tailored suits. The reality was so much worse. Trayvon and Geraldine had taken a wrecking ball to the very foundation of the empire Isaiah had built. I pulled up a folder labeled Offshore Liabilities. I started opening PDF after PDF, my eyes scanning the fine print of massive corporate loan agreements. They had secretly leveraged the physical assets of the logistics firm. They had used our highly classified government defense contracts as collateral to secure massive unregulated loans from shadow banks located in the Cayman Islands. I highlighted the bottom line on the master spreadsheet. I read the number aloud, my voice echoing in the absolute silence of the law office. $15 million. Elias stood up from his chair, walking around the desk to stare at the screen. He took off his glasses, rubbing his eyes in sheer disbelief. They had drained $15 million in liquid cash from international lenders. They had funneled the money through dummy corporations and fake vendor invoices directly into their own private accounts. This was how Geraldine funded her lavish country club galas. This was how Trayvon paid for his luxury sports cars. This was how Meredith afforded the massive diamond necklaces she loved to flaunt at high society events. They were living like billionaires on stolen, highly illegal money. But the most damning piece of evidence was sitting in a folder labeled Authorizations. I clicked open the scanned signature pages of the offshore loan agreements. For a loan of that magnitude against a defense firm, the primary owner had to authorize the transaction. I stared at the signature line. It was Isaiah's name, but it was not his handwriting. Trayvon had authorized every single illegal loan by completely forging his own brother's signature. He had committed federal wire fraud, international money laundering, and corporate embezzlement on a scale that would carry a mandatory federal prison sentence. I sat back in the leather chair, staring at the glowing screen. The absolute brilliance of my husband's final act finally clicked into place. Isaiah had discovered the massive embezzlement in his final weeks of life. He knew the stress of it was killing him. But he also knew that if he simply fired his brother Trayvon, and Geraldine would drag the company through endless litigation, destroying the firm and dragging my name through the mud in the process. They would have claimed the loans were legitimate business expenses. They would have tied me up in court for the rest of my life. So Isaiah had said absolutely nothing. He had quietly gathered every single piece of evidence, encrypted it on a military drive, and left it in a box he knew they would overlook. Elias leaned his hands flat on the desk, his eyes wide as he looked at the $15 million debt staring back at him. He looked at me, and he stated exactly what we were both realizing in real time. The logistics company was no longer a profitable empire. It was an insolvent shell. It was a $15 million federal crime scene. And just hours ago, Trayvon and Geraldine had happily produced a forged will and fought tooth and nail in a probate court to take absolute total sole control of it. They had aggressively locked me out of the company to protect their theft, completely unaware that they had just locked themselves inside a burning building. Elias stared at the glowing screen of the air-gapped laptop, his breath catching in his throat. For a man who had spent 30 years tearing apart corrupt executives in federal courtrooms, it took a lot to leave him speechless. But the sheer scale of the fraud staring back at us was staggering. Trayvon and Geraldine had not just stolen money, they had orchestrated a financial massacre. He slowly sat back in his heavy leather chair, running a hand over his face. He looked at the $15 million deficit, then looked at the forged signatures on the offshore loan documents. He shook his head in absolute disgust. He muttered that he had seen a lot of greedy relatives in his career, but this level of parasitic destruction was unprecedented. Isaiah had spent 2 decades serving his country, building a pristine reputation, and his own mother and brother had used that exact reputation as collateral to fund their luxury cars and country club memberships. The shock wore off quickly, and Elias immediately shifted into apex predator mode. He reached across the glass desk and picked up his desk phone. He told me he was calling his contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service right this second. He said we had everything we needed to have Trayvon arrested for wire fraud and corporate embezzlement before the sun went down. He started dialing the numbers with furious precision. I reached across the desk and slammed my hand down firmly over the receiver, cutting the call off. Elias looked up at me, his eyes wide with confusion. He asked me what I was doing. He urged me to let him make the call, insisting that we had them dead to rights. I shook my head slowly. I took a deep breath and forced myself to detach from the blinding anger I felt. I had to look at this exactly the way Isaiah had looked at it, like a battlefield. I told Elias to look closer at the documents on the screen. I pointed directly at the signature lines on the massive corporate loans from the Cayman Islands. I asked Elias whose name was printed on the bottom line. Elias looked down. He read Isaiah's name out loud. The realization hit him like a physical blow. I explained the fatal flaw in his plan. If we blew the whistle right now, the company was still technically part of Isaiah's unresolved estate. The massive loans bore Isaiah's signature. If federal agents raided the logistics firm tomorrow morning, Trayvon would simply play the victim. He would look the federal agents right in the eye and claim he knew nothing about the offshore accounts. Geraldine would hire the most expensive defense attorneys in Washington, D.C., paid for by the frozen company funds that I currently could not touch. I painted the ugly picture for Elias. They would claim Isaiah orchestrated the entire massive fraud before his heart attack. They would say Trevon was just a naive younger brother trying to keep the business afloat after a sudden tragedy. Because Isaiah was dead, he could not testify to defend himself. Dead men cannot take the witness stand. The federal government would freeze every single asset tied to Isaiah's name, including my personal accounts, while they launched an investigation that could last half a decade. My husband's decorated military legacy would be dragged through the mud. He would be remembered by the public as a traitor and an embezzler, and I would be left completely bankrupt fighting a ghost of a case against my wealthy, untouchable in-laws. Elias slowly put the phone down. He leaned back, lacing his fingers together. He asked me what exactly I wanted to do. If we could not go to the authorities now, how were we supposed to stop them from draining whatever was left of the company? I looked Elias dead in the eye and told him we were not going to stop them. We were going to give them exactly what they asked for. I told him we were going to surrender. Elias practically jumped out of his chair. He asked me if the grief had finally made me lose my mind. He refused to let me walk away from a $20 million empire just because the fight would be difficult. He said I had a legal right to 50% of those voting shares, and he was not going to let Geraldine and Trevon bully me into submission. I held up a hand silencing his protests. I told him to listen to me carefully. I broke down the corporate liability laws for him. Right now, the company was in probate limbo. But if Trevon and Geraldine signed a binding, irrevocable settlement agreement to take sole ownership of the estate in its entirety, they would not just be inheriting the assets. They would legally assume 100% of the liabilities. By forcing me out of the company, they were desperately trying to protect their theft. But if I legally and voluntarily removed myself from the equation, they would strip themselves of their only available scapegoat. I explained that we needed them to stand in front of a judge and demand full ownership. We needed them to sign their names on the dotted line, taking complete financial responsibility for the logistics firm exactly as it was. The moment the judge banged his gavel and legally transferred the company solely into their names, the $15 million offshore debt would no longer belong to Isaiah's estate. It would belong entirely undeniably to Trevon and Geraldine. I leaned across the desk. I told Elias I needed him to draft a comprehensive forfeiture agreement. I needed a document so airtight, so legally binding, that once the ink dried, they could never back out. I told him to wrap it in a beautiful bow of absolute defeat. We had to make them believe they had successfully starved me out financially. We had to make them think I was a broken, exhausted widow who simply did not have the funds or the willpower to fight their forged will in a drawn-out court battle. A slow, predatory smile began to spread across Elias' face. He finally saw the entire board. He realized that Isaiah had not just left me a box of evidence. He had left me the blueprint for a perfect legal execution. Elias pulled his keyboard toward him and immediately started drafting the preliminary settlement terms. The mood in the corner office shifted instantly from panic to cold, calculated strategy. We were setting up the ultimate ambush. We spent the next 2 hours going over the exact wording of the forfeiture contract. I used my background as a corporate auditor to make sure every single clause insulated my personal clean assets while handing them the entirety of the poisoned corporate empire. We made sure the language explicitly stated that the new owners assumed all existing debts known and unknown. Just as Elias hit print to generate the first physical draft for my review, my cell phone vibrated sharply against the glass desk. I picked it up. It was a mass email sent from Geraldine's social secretary. It was a digital invitation to a lavish, highly exclusive event. The bold, elegant text announced a memorial gala to honor Isaiah's legacy and his military service. But I knew exactly what this really was. It was not a memorial. It was a coronation. Geraldine was hosting this massive event at her elite country club to officially introduce Trevon as the new chief executive officer to all the military generals and wealthy investors. The dress code was listed as strict black tie. I scrolled to the very bottom of the ornate digital invitation. A specific highlighted line of text caught my eye, making my blood run completely cold. Geraldine had not just sent this to me as a taunt. She had sent it to make a very clear, very public statement to the rest of Washington society. The bottom line explicitly stated that the widow Camille was entirely uninvited from the premises. The digital invitation to the memorial gala sat on my phone screen like an active threat. Geraldine had explicitly uninvited me, but she had severely underestimated the woman her son had married. I did not spend the next 3 days crying in my apartment. I spent them preparing for war. I went straight to an exclusive boutique in Georgetown. My corporate assets might have been frozen by Traven and his corrupt judge, but my private consulting accounts were completely untouched. Before I ever met Isaiah, I had built a lucrative career as an independent auditor, and that clean money was entirely mine. I purchased a custom floor-length emerald green silk gown. It was flawless. It was armor. I paired it with the diamond stud earrings Isaiah had given me for our 5th anniversary. When I pulled up to the valet stand at the prestigious country club on Saturday night, I stepped out of my car looking exactly like the powerful executive I was. The country club was a fortress of Washington, D.C. high society, all towering marble pillars and massive crystal chandeliers. I walked up the sweeping stone staircase, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble, my head held high. I was walking into the lion's den, and I was entirely unafraid. Geraldine was stationed right at the entrance of the grand ballroom, greeting a 4-star general and his wife. She was draped in a black velvet dress, playing the role of the dignified, grieving mother to absolute perfection. Then she saw me. The fake smile dropped from her face, instantly replaced by a flash of pure, unadulterated panic. She excused herself from the general and marched directly into my path, physically blocking the heavy double doors. "What are you doing here?" Geraldine hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper so the other wealthy guests would not hear. "You are explicitly told you are not welcome. You are a classless embarrassment, Camille. Turn around and leave before I have the security team drag you out of this building." I did not flinch. I stood my ground, looking down at her with absolute calm. I reminded her of a very simple legal fact. I told her that until the probate court officially concluded its business and finalized the transfer of assets, I was still the legal owner of 50% of the voting shares for the logistics firm. I explained that if she tried to deny a majority shareholder entry to a corporate-sponsored event, I would call my attorney and have the entire gala shut down for violating the corporate bylaws. I watched the muscle in Geraldine's jaw twitch. She knew I had her cornered. She could not risk a massive public scandal in front of the military generals and defense contractors she was trying so desperately to impress. She stepped aside, glaring daggers at me, and I glided right past her into the grand ballroom. The room was breathtaking. It was packed with wealthy investors, politicians, and high-ranking military officials who had worked with Isaiah for years. I navigated the crowd gracefully, accepting quiet condolences from colleagues who genuinely respected my husband. But the peace did not last long. I was standing near the center of the room, holding a glass of sparkling water when Meredith spotted me. She was wearing a completely inappropriate flashy silver dress, holding a massive glass of red wine. She locked eyes with me, and I saw the malicious intent wash over her face. She walked directly toward me, her pace slightly too fast. Just as she was passing by, she suddenly tripped over absolutely nothing. She lunged forward, throwing the entire glass of dark red wine directly down the front of my emerald green silk gown. The cold liquid soaked through the fabric, instantly leaving a massive dark stain across my chest. Several guests nearby gasped in shock. The conversations around us ground to a halt. "Oh my goodness, Camille!" Meredith cried out, her voice unnaturally loud to ensure everyone in our vicinity was watching. "I am so incredibly sorry. I am just so clumsy." She reached out to dab at my dress with a cocktail napkin, but I stepped back immediately. Meredith put a hand over her heart, projecting fake sympathy to the onlookers, while her eyes danced with cruel delight. "Please let me pay to have that replaced," Meredith said, projecting her voice even louder. "I know things must be so incredibly tight for you right now, especially since Trayvon had to freeze all of your bank accounts. I would just hate for you to be financially ruined over a ruined dress. You just let me know how much you need to get by." I stood there feeling the cold wine seeping into my skin. Everyone was staring at me. They were waiting for me to snap. Meredith and Geraldine wanted me to scream, to slap her, to cause the exact kind of loud, emotional scene that would prove I did not belong in their elite circle. They wanted me to look like the angry, unhinged woman they always claimed I was. I did not give them a single ounce of satisfaction. I looked Meredith straight in the eyes and offered her a serene, unbothered smile. I told her not to worry about it because I always come prepared to clean up a mess. Before Meredith could respond to my calm dismissal, the lights in the ballroom dimmed. A bright spotlight hit the main stage at the front of the room. Trevon walked up to the podium, adjusting his expensive tie. The crowd quieted down, turning their attention to the front. Trevon leaned into the microphone and began to deliver a grand sweeping speech about Isaiah's legacy. He spoke about growing up together, about the values of hard work and military discipline. He talked for 20 minutes, weaving a beautiful, completely fabricated story about how Isaiah had spent his final days preparing Trevon to take over the empire. Trevon stood in front of the investors and the military generals and officially announced himself as the sole inheritor of the company. He declared himself the only man capable of leading the logistics firm into the future. He did not mention my name once. He completely erased my 7 years of marriage, my role as chief financial officer, and my contributions to building the very company he was now claiming as his own. The crowd erupted into applause. They raised their champagne glasses to toast the new king. I did not stay to watch him bask in the stolen glory. I turned away from the cheering crowd and quietly slipped through the French doors, stepping out onto the sweeping stone balcony overlooking the golf course. The night air was crisp and cool, a welcome relief from the suffocating atmosphere inside. I stood alone in the dark, pulling a handkerchief from my clutch. I slowly wiped the spilled red wine from my hands. Through the glass doors behind me, I could hear the cheers and the laughter of my in-laws celebrating their massive victory. They felt completely invincible. They had publicly humiliated me, locked me out of the business, and claimed absolute control in front of the most powerful people in Washington. I looked out over the dark, sprawling grounds of the country club and smiled. It was a genuine, brilliant smile. The trap was perfectly set. They were drunk on their own arrogance, completely blinded by greed and social climbing. They were so desperate to take the crown that they had not even bothered to check if it was laced with poison. Now all I had to do was call for a mediation meeting and hand them the keys to their own absolute destruction. On Monday morning, I walked into my attorney Elias' office wearing a beige off-the-rack blouse that was deliberately a little wrinkled. I'd spent the weekend mentally preparing for the greatest acting performance of my entire life. I wore absolutely no makeup. I pulled my hair back into a messy low ponytail. I let the natural exhaustion of burying my husband and the sheer trauma of the past week show fully on my face. When I looked in the mirror, I did not see the sharp, high-powered corporate auditor who had dominated Washington boardrooms. I saw a broken, financially drained, grieving widow who had completely run out of fight, which was exactly what Trevon and Geraldine needed to see. Elias had booked his largest, most intimidating mahogany conference room for the mediation. He had sent the formal request to Trevon's legal team at dawn, stating that his client was willing to discuss an immediate out-of-court settlement to resolve the probate dispute. They took the bait instantly. Less than 3 hours later, the heavy glass doors of the conference room swung open. Trevon walked in first, wearing a tailored charcoal suit and a gold watch I knew cost more than a luxury car. Geraldine followed right behind him, draped in a pristine white cashmere coat, her chin held high as if she were entering a throne room. Meredith trailed them both, her blonde hair perfectly blown out, clutching a designer handbag that was absolutely paid for by the stolen corporate funds. They had brought their high-priced estate lawyer with them, a smug-looking man, who clearly thought this meeting was going to be a walk in the park. They took their seats on the opposite side of the massive mahogany table. The contrast between us was stark and intentional. They looked like Washington royalty, dripping in stolen wealth, radiating absolute arrogance. I sat slumped in my chair next to Elias, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the polished wood of the table. Elias opened the mediation. He used his best serious professional tone, explaining that the emergency injunction freezing my assets had caused undue financial hardship. He stated that rather than engaging in a protracted legal battle over the forged will, I was prepared to step away from the logistics firm entirely provided we could reach a swift and clean resolution. Geraldine let out a soft, mocking laugh. She leaned back in her plush leather chair and crossed her legs. She did not even bother to look at Elias. She kept her cold, predatory gaze locked directly on me. "There is nothing to negotiate," Camille Geraldine stated, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "My son left his empire to his bloodline. The court has already recognized Traven as the acting executive. We are simply here to find out how quickly you are going to pack up and get out of our way." I forced my hands to tremble slightly. I looked up at her, making sure she saw the dark circles under my eyes. "I just want to be done with this, Geraldine," I said, keeping my voice quiet and unsteady. "Isaiah is gone. The injunction has completely frozen my checking accounts. I cannot pay the mortgage on the house this month. I cannot afford to pay Elias to fight you in probate court for the next 5 years. I am exhausted. You have won. I just want to know what it is going to take for you to let me walk away in peace." Traven's lawyer smiled, clearly thrilled by my rapid capitulation. He leaned forward and opened a thick leather folder. He began to list their terms, but Trayvon held up a hand to stop him. Trayvon wanted the satisfaction of delivering the final blow himself. "We want everything," Trayvon said, leaning his elbows on the table and staring me down. "You sign a binding, irrevocable forfeiture agreement today. You waive any and all marital rights to the logistics firm. You sign over your 50% voting shares. You surrender your claim to the primary residence. You hand over the investment portfolios, the vehicles, and every single corporate asset attached to Isaiah's name. You walk away with absolutely nothing but the clothes on your back." Elias immediately jumped into character. He slammed his hand down on the table, acting thoroughly outraged. He told Trayvon's lawyer that these demands were completely draconian and absurd. He insisted that as the legal spouse I was entitled to at least a significant severance package or a buyout of my shares. Geraldine interrupted him smoothly. "If she fights us for a buyout, we will tie her up in litigation until she is completely bankrupt," Geraldine warned, her tone dripping with venom. "We will sue her for corporate mismanagement. We will drag her background through the press. We will make sure she never works as an auditor in this city again. But if she signs the forfeiture agreement right now, we will graciously agree not to pursue her for our legal fees. She can take her little degree and go start over somewhere else." I buried my face in my hands. I let my shoulders shake. I thought about the moment the honor guard handed me the folded American flag at Isaiah's funeral. I thought about the man I loved cold and gone. The tears that filled my eyes were incredibly real, born from a place of profound, shattering grief. But across the table, my in-laws interpreted my tears as the ultimate sign of my absolute defeat. "Please," I whispered through my fingers, my voice breaking perfectly. "If I sign everything over to you, you have to promise to assume total liability. I cannot have the company debts coming back to ruin me later. I just need a clean break." Trayvon's lawyer chuckled softly. "That is standard procedure in a total forfeiture, Mrs. Camille. My clients will assume 100% ownership of the estate, including all assets, holdings, and existing liabilities. You will be entirely removed from the corporate structure." The lawyer slid a thick stack of legal documents across the smooth mahogany table. The preliminary settlement agreement. It was the exact trap Elias and I had spent hours crafting, perfectly disguised as their ultimate victory. It explicitly stated that Trayvon and Geraldine accepted the company exactly as it was, voluntarily claiming total, undeniable responsibility for every single financial obligation attached to the firm. I stared at the paperwork. I let my hand hover over the table, projecting a profound sense of hesitation. I looked at Elias, who gave me a very convincing grim nod of resignation, playing the part of the defeated attorney perfectly. Meredith could not handle the silence. She was practically vibrating with malicious excitement. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a heavy silver fountain pen, and slid it across the table toward me. It rolled smoothly and stopped right in front of the signature line. "Just sign it, sweetie," Meredith said, flashing me a condescending bright white smile. "It is over. You tried to fit in with us, but you always knew you did not belong in this family. Just sign the paper and go start over. Maybe you can find a nice man in your own tax bracket next time. I looked at Meredith. I looked at the smug, arrogant faces of the people who had despised me from the moment Isaiah brought me home. They were so blinded by their own elitism, so obsessed with claiming my husband's wealth, that they never bothered to look beneath the surface. They were eagerly demanding the keys to a kingdom that was currently sitting on top of $15 million in fraudulent illegal federal debt. I picked up the silver pen. The cool metal felt heavy and solid in my grip. I did not say another word. I lowered my head and signed my name on the dotted line. I signed the transfer of shares. I signed the forfeiture of the estate. I signed away every single piece of the poisoned, debt-ridden logistics firm legally chaining Trayvon and Geraldine to the massive federal crime they had committed. Elias collected the documents and handed copies to their attorney. The lawyer reviewed the signatures, smiled brightly, and nodded at Trayvon. Geraldine stood up, buttoning her pristine white cashmere coat. She looked down at me one last time, her eyes filled with absolute triumph. "You have 72 hours to vacate my son's house," Camille Geraldine stated coldly. "I suggest you start packing immediately. I will be sending a moving crew on Thursday morning to ensure you do not try to steal any of the furniture on your way out." They turned and walked out of the conference room, their laughter echoing down the hallway as the heavy glass doors swung shut behind them. They thought they had just ruined my life. They thought I was going to be homeless and destitute. They had no idea that hidden safely in a completely separate, untouchable trust were the real assets Isaiah had left me. A pristine multi-million-dollar life insurance policy and a clean stock portfolio that had absolutely nothing to do with the logistics firm. As the sound of their footsteps faded away, I slowly sat up straight in my chair. I wiped the tears from my cheeks. I looked over at Elias, and the broken, exhausted widow vanished completely. I offered my attorney a cold, sharp smile. The ambush was complete. Now all I had to do was wait for them to show up at my house and claim their prize. 3 days before the final probate court hearing, the morning sun was just beginning to break over the historic row houses of our Washington, D.C. neighborhood. I was standing in the kitchen sipping a cup of black coffee, surrounded by the quiet memories of my husband. I knew they were coming. Predators never wait patiently for their prey to bleed out. They always want to rush the kill to claim their prize. I had handed them the keys to a $15 million federal crime scene, and the next few days were about playing my part to absolute perfection. A heavy, aggressive pounding echoed from the solid oak front door. It was not a polite knock, it was a demand. I set my coffee mug down on the granite counter, smoothed out my plain gray sweater, and walked slowly to the entryway. When I opened the door, I found exactly what I had anticipated. Geraldine was standing on my front porch, bundled in a designer trench coat, her chin raised in a posture of absolute authority. Meredith stood right beside her, holding a clipboard and looking incredibly smug. Behind them, idling loudly in the narrow historic street, was a massive commercial moving truck. 4 burly men in matching uniforms were already lowering the metal loading ramp. Geraldine did not even wait for me to speak. She pushed right past me, her expensive perfume filling the hallway. She announced that as the sole incoming owner of the estate, she had a legal right to secure the physical assets of the property immediately. She told me the grace period was officially over. I had 72 hours to vacate according to our mediation agreement, but she was not going to let me spend those hours stripping the house of its valuables. She waved the moving crew inside, instructing them to begin inventorying the high-end furniture on the first floor. I stepped back and let them invade my home. I kept my posture slightly slouched, projecting the image of a woman who had completely given up. I watched silently as total strangers walked into my living room with clipboards and pricing stickers. They began tagging the custom leather sofas Isaiah and I had picked out together. They tagged the antique dining table where we had hosted Thanksgiving dinners for our friends. I did not shed a single tear. I knew none of this furniture mattered. It was all tied to the poisoned estate, and it was all going to be seized by the federal government very soon. Meredith walked past me and headed straight for the home office I had shared with Isaiah. I followed her at a slow, defeated pace. She was standing in the center of the room, looking around with absolute disdain. She walked over to the wall where my framed degrees and professional certifications were hung. She reached up and pulled my Howard University diploma off the wall. She held the heavy mahogany frame in her hands, inspecting it with a cruel, mocking smile. Meredith turned to me and sighed dramatically. She told me it was really cute that I was so proud of this little degree. She said attending a historically black college was a nice cultural experience, but it obviously had not prepared me to operate in the real elite circles of the capital. She tapped her manicured fingernails against the glass. She told me that I had always been completely out of my depth in this neighborhood. She said this zip code was reserved for generational wealth, for families who actually built the city, not for working-class girls who married up out of sheer charity. She casually dropped my framed diploma directly into a cardboard moving box on the floor. It landed with a heavy, careless thud. Before I could respond, Geraldine walked into the office. She looked at me as if I were a pest infesting her property. She told me I was wasting their time standing around. She ordered me to go upstairs and pack my personal belongings immediately. I walked up the hardwood stairs to the master bedroom. Geraldine followed closely behind me, determined to supervise my exit. She wanted to ensure I did not take any jewelry or high-value items that she felt rightfully belonged to her bloodline. I pulled a single medium-sized suitcase from the closet. I started neatly folding my slacks and blouses. Geraldine crossed her arms, tapping her foot impatiently against the floorboards. She told the moving crew in the hallway that I was moving too slowly. She told a mover to go out to the truck and grab a roll of heavy-duty industrial garbage bags. When the man brought the bags upstairs, Geraldine snatched them from his hand. She threw the cheap plastic bags onto the center of my pristine duvet cover. She told me she was not going to wait around all day for me to fold my cheap clothes. She demanded that I throw everything into the trash bags and get out of her house before noon. I looked at the black plastic bags resting on the bed. I looked at Geraldine's face twisted with spite and impatience. She wanted me to snap. She wanted me to cry and beg her for a little more dignity. She wanted to break my spirit completely before she kicked me out onto the street. But I knew that true power is completely silent. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I calmly opened the plastic bags and began tossing my sweaters, jeans, and shoes inside. I packed only my absolute essentials. I left the expensive designer gowns hanging in the closet. I left the high-end purses sitting on the shelves. They were all purchased with shared marital funds, which meant they were officially part of the estate. Let her have them. I knew they would be seized by the Internal Revenue Service to pay off the massive fraud debt soon enough anyway. I zipped up my single suitcase and tied the 2 garbage bags shut. I walked over to the heavy wooden dresser in the corner of the room. Resting on top was the folded American burial flag from Isaiah's funeral encased in a clear protective shadow box. Next to it was a sleek black leather briefcase. I picked up the flag and held it gently against my chest. Then I grabbed the heavy handle of the briefcase. Geraldine eyed the briefcase suspiciously. She stepped into my path and demanded to know what was inside. She told me no corporate documents were allowed to leave the premises under the terms of the settlement. I clicked the brass locks open and let the top pop up. I turned it toward her so she could see inside. There were copies of my personal birth certificate, my passport, and a thick stack of legal documents. I told her they were just my personal identification files and the paperwork for a basic life insurance policy. She scoffed, clearly unimpressed, and waved her hand dismissively, telling me to take it and go. She had absolutely no idea what she was looking at. She had no idea that the paperwork inside that briefcase secured a perfectly clean, multi-million-dollar private trust that Isaiah had set up entirely independent of the logistics firm. My husband knew his brother was destroying the company, so he had meticulously carved out a fortune just for me, completely shielded from probate and creditors. That briefcase held my true inheritance, completely untouched by the $15 million federal fraud she was about to eagerly claim as her own. I walked down the stairs for the final time. The movers were already carrying my dining room chairs out the front door. I stepped out onto the front porch carrying my suitcase, the garbage bags, the flag, and my briefcase. The crisp morning air hit my face. My Uber was already idling at the curb. I loaded the heavy black trash bags into the trunk. I carefully placed my suitcase next to them. I kept the folded flag and the leather briefcase in my hands, sliding into the back seat of the car. I rolled down the window as the driver put the car into gear. I looked back at the beautiful historic house Isaiah and I had shared. Meredith and Geraldine were standing together on the top step of the porch. Meredith had her phone raised high in the air, capturing a photo of the two of them smiling brightly with the moving truck in the background. My phone vibrated in my purse. I pulled it out and opened my social media feed. Meredith had already posted the photo. She had tagged the location of my house, showing it off to all of her high society friends. The caption underneath her bright, victorious smile read simply, "New beginnings." I locked my phone screen, leaned back against the headrest, and smiled as the car drove away. She had no idea just how accurate that caption was about to be. The morning of the final probate hearing arrived with a cold, unrelenting gray sky that cast a solemn shadow over the neoclassical stone pillars of the Washington, D.C. courthouse. I spent the early hours of the morning in my new downtown high-rise apartment, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city skyline. The space was quiet, pristine, and entirely funded by the clean, separate trust Isaiah had meticulously built to protect me. While my in-laws spent the last 48 hours celebrating their supposed victory, Elias and the federal task force had been quietly setting the ultimate legal ambush. The encrypted data from Isaiah's military footlocker had already been submitted to the IRS and the FBI under the federal whistleblower program. The trap was fully operational, and all we needed now was for the probate court to lock the heavy steel doors behind them. I arrived at the courthouse wearing a conservative, unadorned charcoal wool suit. I carried no designer handbag, wore no flashy jewelry, and left my hair pinned back in a tight, modest bun. I wanted to look exactly like the defeated, financially paralyzed widow they believed they had broken. When Elias and I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the courtroom, the immediate shift in the room's energy was palpable. The gallery was completely packed. Geraldine had mobilized her entire social network, turning a routine probate hearing into a public spectator sport. DC's self-proclaimed African-American elite filled the wooden benches, draped in expensive fur coats, tailored wool blazers, and strings of pearls. These were the women Geraldine gossiped with at the country club, the men my father-in-law had served on elite charity boards with. They had all been brought here to witness my absolute, public execution. As I walked down the center aisle, the room filled with sharp whispers and tight, judgmental murmurs. I heard the low comments floating from the rows, remarks about how a working-class girl from the wrong side of town had tried to climb too high and had finally been put back in her place. I kept my gaze fixed straight ahead, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me look down. I took my seat at the defense table next to Elias. He sat perfectly composed, his leather briefcase open, sorting through his files with the calm demeanor of a man who already knew the weather report for the storm that was about to hit. I held a single slim manila folder in my lap, looking entirely submissive and resigned. Across the aisle at the plaintiff's table, the optical display of stolen wealth was staggering. Trevon was sitting with his chest out, wearing a custom white collared shirt beneath a tailored three-piece suit. He looked like a man who had already been crowned king, leaning back in his chair and whispering arrogantly to his high-priced estate attorney. Sitting right next to him was Meredith. She was practically glowing with malicious satisfaction, her blonde hair styled into a perfect, sleek blowout. She had deliberately chosen to wear a massive multi-carat diamond tennis bracelet and a platinum pendant that caught the harsh fluorescent lighting of the courtroom every time she moved. It was a direct taunt, a visual proclamation that the $15 million they had illegally secured from the Cayman Islands was now officially hers to spend. Behind them sat Geraldine, occupying the front row of the gallery like a queen mother on a throne. She wore an impeccable dark navy designer suit. Her hands gloved her face, arranged in an expression of cold, aristocratic perfection. When Meredith looked over at my table, she caught my eye and flashed a slow, victorious smirk. She leaned over to Trayvon, muttering something that made him chuckle softly. They were completely drunk on their own arrogance, entirely convinced that they had successfully starved me out and evicted me from my own life. The heavy wooden side door opened, and the bailiff stood at attention, calling the courtroom to order. Everyone in the gallery rose in a wave of rustling wool and silk as the judge stepped onto the bench. He was a stern, no-nonsense man with sharp gray eyes and a reputation for absolute procedural discipline. He adjusted his heavy black robe, sat down, and immediately began reviewing the thick stack of files resting on his desk. The courtroom fell into a suffocating, tense silence. The only sound was the sharp rustle of legal documents as the judge turned the pages. I watched his eyes scan the final settlement agreement, the binding, irrevocable total forfeiture contract that I had signed in Elias' office. This was the document where I voluntarily waived all marital rights to the logistics firm, the primary residence, and the investment portfolios. But more importantly, it was the document where Trevon and Geraldine explicitly, unconditionally accepted the estate in its entirety, taking 100% legal and financial responsibility for all existing debts, liabilities, and corporate obligations, both known and unknown. The judge's hand stopped midair. His brow furrowed deeply as he read the specific indemnity clauses Elias and I had meticulously woven into the text. For a seasoned probate judge, a total unconditional surrender of a $20 million estate by a legal spouse without a single objection was entirely unprecedented. He took off his reading glasses, letting them hang from the cord around his neck, and stared down at the paperwork with a heavy, skeptical frown. He tapped his fountain pen sharply against the wooden bench, the rhythmic clicking sound echoing like a countdown through the silent room. He looked up, his sharp gaze sweeping across the courtroom. He bypassed Trevon and Meredith's eager, smiling faces and looked directly at the legal teams. He did not call the case to order for the gallery. Instead, he leaned forward, fixed his eyes on Trevon's attorney and Elias, and spoke in a low, gravelly tone that carried an unmistakable weight of authority. "Counselors, I need both of you to approach the bench immediately," the judge commanded, gesturing with his pen. "Bring the primary execution files with you." Trevon's attorney jumped out of his chair with an eager, confident smile smoothing down his jacket as he grabbed his leather folder. He looked back at Trevon and gave him a subtle, triumphant thumbs up, signaling that this was just a final formality before the crown was officially placed on his head. Elias stood up calmly, buttoning his blazer with slow, methodical deliberation. He picked up our copy of the agreement and walked toward the elevated bench. I sat perfectly still at the defense table, my fingers laced tightly together over the manila folder in my lap. Behind me, I could hear Geraldine leaning forward in her bench, her sharp, quiet whisper cutting through the space as she muttered to Meredith about preparing the press release for the business journals the second the gavel fell. They had absolutely no idea that the judge was not looking at a standard contract of surrender. He was looking at a binding legal execution doc, and they had just handed me the rope. The judge stared down at the paperwork with his reading glasses hanging loosely around his neck. The heavy silence in the courtroom was absolutely suffocating. I could hear the faint ticking of the large analog clock mounted on the mahogany-paneled wall. I could smell the overwhelming blend of expensive designer perfumes wafting from the gallery where Geraldine's high society friends sat waiting for my public execution. At the plaintiff's table, Trevon adjusted the cuffs of his custom-tailored shirt, utterly oblivious to the profound legal scrutiny happening right in front of him. Meredith sat next to him, her eyes darting nervously toward the bench, clearly impatient for the gavel to strike so she could finally claim her stolen fortune. The judge did not address the gallery. He raised his hand and motioned for Elias and Trevon's high-priced estate attorney to approach the bench. Elias stood up with calm, methodical precision. He buttoned his dark blazer and walked forward with the steady confidence of a man who had orchestrated this exact scenario down to the millisecond. Trevon's lawyer practically sprinted to the front of the courtroom, clutching his leather briefcase against his side like a shield. I remained perfectly still at the defense table. My hands were folded neatly over the plain manila folder in my lap. I kept my posture deliberately submissive, casting my eyes downward, projecting the absolute exhaustion of a widow who had been entirely defeated. But beneath my quiet exterior, my heart was beating with a fierce, triumphant rhythm. The judge leaned over the heavy wooden barricade of the bench. He kept his voice lowered to a sharp, intense whisper that did not carry to the gallery, but the frustration radiating from his posture was undeniable. He pointed a firm finger directly at the forfeiture clause on the first page of the settlement agreement. He asked Elias how any competent ethical attorney could allow a grieving widow to sign away a generational fortune without negotiating a single financial concession. He noted that giving up 50% of a $20 million government defense firm, along with a historic primary residence and all liquid investment portfolios, was entirely unprecedented in his courtroom. Elias played the role of the reluctant, exhausted advocate to absolute perfection. He leaned forward and told the judge that the emotional toll of fighting a forged will against a deeply hostile family had simply broken his client. He explained that I was financially paralyzed by the emergency injunction and that my only desire was to secure a clean, immediate break from the toxic environment my in-laws had created. Trayvon's lawyer immediately chimed in, his voice thick with corporate arrogance. He assured the judge that everything was completely above board and strictly legal. He stated that the family was simply taking back the empire that rightfully belonged to their bloodline. He argued that my total surrender was a gracious acceptance of reality and that his clients were being incredibly generous by agreeing not to pursue me for their extensive legal fees. The judge looked utterly repulsed by the sheer greed dripping from the opposing counsel's words. He possessed decades of experience in the probate division, and he knew a coordinated financial hijacking when he saw one. But he was also strictly bound by the confines of the law. The documents Elias had drafted were flawless. The settlement was heavily notarized, completely voluntary on paper, and legally impenetrable. If two parties agreed to a mutual settlement to avoid a protracted trial, the court had a minimal basis to reject it, provided no overt coercion was taking place. The judge sighed heavily, a deep sound of judicial resignation. He dismissed the attorneys back to their respective tables. Elias walked back and took his seat beside me, giving me a microscopic, almost imperceptible nod. The first hurdle was cleared. The judge directed his sharp, piercing gaze entirely onto me. The physical sensation of hundreds of eyes shifting from the bench to the defense table was intense. The gallery members leaned forward in their solid wooden pews, hungry for the final act of my humiliation. Behind the plaintiff's table, I heard the sharp rustle of expensive navy wool. Geraldine shifted her weight in the front row. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing into tiny, threatening slits. I could feel her malicious energy radiating across the aisle. It was a silent, venomous warning. She thought I was going to have a last-minute change of heart under the intense pressure of the courtroom. She thought the reality of losing $20 million was finally hitting me, and that I was about to burst into tears and beg the judge for a tiny financial crumb to survive on. She wanted me to beg so she could have the deep satisfaction of watching the judge deny me. The judge cleared his throat loudly. The microphone mounted on his desk amplified his deep, commanding voice across the packed gallery, silencing the lingering whispers instantly. Mrs. Camille, you are waiving your marital right to an estate valued on paper at $20 million. Your attorney is present. Are you of sound mind and acting without coercion? The question hung heavily in the sterile, conditioned air of the courtroom. It was the ultimate legal safeguard, the final barrier before the absolute transfer of power. I did not answer right away. I took my time. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. I smoothed down the front of my unadorned charcoal suit. I did not look at the judge. I turned my head slowly and looked directly across the aisle. I bypassed Trayvon and his arrogant smirk. I bypassed Meredith and the stolen diamonds glittering on her wrist. I locked eyes completely and exclusively with Geraldine. I poured 7 years of history into that unbroken gaze. I thought about the constant microaggressions she had hurled at me during family dinners. I thought about the endless insults regarding my working-class background. I thought about her dropping that velvet box onto my dining table and demanding Isaiah's watch while his body was barely cold. She tried to intimidate me with her glare, trying to assert her dominance as the matriarch of the elite. But I was an impenetrable wall of ice. I let her look deep into my eyes and see that I was not afraid of her. I turned my face back to the bench, my voice ringing out with crystal clear precision. I am of sound mind, Your Honor. Geraldine and Trayvon have made it clear they want everything Isaiah left behind. I believe they deserve exactly what they have earned. A soft murmur rippled through the high society gallery behind me. They thought my words were the bitter, defeated parting shot of a woman who had finally realized she was entirely outmatched. Geraldine actually let out a quiet, scoffing laugh, settling back into her wooden pew with the deeply satisfied posture of a conqueror who had just watched her enemy drop their sword. The judge absorbed my statement carefully. He sensed the heavy, unspoken weight behind my words. He studied my perfectly calm demeanor, searching for any sign of hesitation or duress. He found absolutely none. I was handing over a massive government logistics firm with the steady, peaceful resolve of a woman walking away from a burning building. The judge nodded slowly, accepting my declaration for the official court record. He turned his attention away from me and focused entirely on the plaintiff's table. He addressed Trayvon and his highly paid legal team, his voice taking on a strict, cautionary tone. He explained the profound legal consequences of total forfeiture. He detailed that by accepting this unprecedented settlement, they were not just acquiring the liquid capital, the corporate contracts, and the real estate. He explicitly warned them that they were adopting a sweeping indemnity clause. They would be legally substituting themselves for the deceased. He asked them if they were absolutely certain their clients wished to assume the estate in its entirety exactly as is. Trayvon was so blinded by his own toxic greed that he did not even let his attorney finish standing up to answer the question. He was desperate to claim the throne, desperate to officially control the millions of dollars he believed were waiting in the corporate accounts. He practically leaped out of his chair, gripping the edge of the plaintiff table with white knuckles. "Yes, Your Honor," Trayvon yelled, his voice echoing loudly off the stone walls of the courtroom. He was grinning from ear to ear, entirely convinced he had just secured generational wealth. He had absolutely no idea that he had just passionately begged a federal judge to hand him a $15 million death sentence. The judge recoiled slightly at the sheer lack of courtroom decorum. He was a man who demanded absolute respect within his walls, and Trayvon's sudden loud outburst was a blatant violation of that standard. The judge frowned deeply, shifting his piercing gaze away from the arrogant younger brother and focusing it entirely on the matriarch sitting in the front row. "Mrs. Geraldine," the judge said, his voice carrying a stern, unforgiving weight. "Your son seems incredibly eager to finalize this transaction. As the secondary claimant on this petition, do you share his absolute certainty? Do you fully understand that by signing this document, you are permanently absolving the defendant of any and all future corporate liabilities?" Geraldine stood up from the heavy wooden pew. She smoothed down the front of her immaculate navy designer suit with her gloved hands. She lifted her chin, projecting that fake aristocratic grace she had spent decades perfecting at elite Washington galas. She looked the judge right in the eye, projecting total, unwavering confidence. "I understand completely, Your Honor," Geraldine stated, her voice smooth and polished. "My son and I are fully prepared to take over the firm. We are ready to restore our family legacy to its proper standing. We accept the estate exactly as it is." The judge stared at her for a long, heavy moment. He looked like a man who was watching a pair of tourists willingly walk into a cage with a starving lion. He knew they were being blinded by their own relentless greed, but his duty was to the letter of the law, not to saving fools from themselves. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Very well," the judge said softly. "Let the record show that the plaintiffs have been thoroughly advised and are proceeding of their own free will." He signaled the court bailiff with a flick of his hand. The bailiff stepped forward, taking the thick stack of settlement documents from the judge's elevated bench. Every single eye in the packed gallery tracked the paperwork as the bailiff carried it across the room. The rustling of expensive silk and wool echoed from the pews as Geraldine's high society friends leaned forward, eager to witness the exact moment I was legally stripped of my wealth. I watched as the bailiff set the heavy stack of papers down on the plaintiff's table directly in front of Trayvon. Trayvon did not even bother to read the final print. He did not ask his high-priced estate attorney to review the indemnity clauses one last time. He reached into the breast pocket of his custom-tailored suit and pulled out a heavy gold pen. He leaned over the mahogany table, acting like a powerful chief executive officer, finalizing a massive corporate acquisition. He signed his name on the primary signature line with an aggressive, dramatic flourish. He flipped to the next page and signed again. He initialed the margins with furious, joyful speed. When he was finished, he pushed the stack of papers across the table toward his mother. Geraldine took her time. She wanted to savor every single second of this moment. She picked up the gold pen. Before she put the ink to the paper, she turned her head and looked directly across the aisle at me. She flashed a cold, victorious smirk. Her eyes were dancing with malicious triumph. She truly believed that this signature was her ultimate victory over the working-class girl she had always despised. She thought she was finally erasing my existence from Isaiah's life. She turned back to the table and wrote her name with sharp, elegant strokes. She signed the transfer of ownership. She signed the assumption of liability. She signed away her own freedom. I looked past her, casting my gaze into the front row of the gallery. Meredith was leaning over the wooden pew, whispering excitedly to another high society wife. She was practically vibrating with greed. She was already mentally spending the money she thought they had just secured. I watched her point to the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist, likely bragging about the upgrades she was going to purchase the second they walked out of the courthouse. As the gold pen glided across the final page, I went over the exact legal reality of what they were doing in my mind. I had worked with Elias for hours in his secure office to ensure there were absolutely no loopholes in this contract. By signing those pages, Trayvon and Geraldine were voluntarily waiving their right to ever pursue me for company assets. They were legally terminating my position as chief financial officer and removing me as a shareholder. But far more importantly, they were activating the total indemnity clause. They were formally substituting themselves as the primary and sole guarantors of the logistics firm. They were taking absolute ownership of the corporate headquarters, the government contracts, and the offshore holding accounts. By demanding the company exactly as is, they were now legally bound to the $15 million fraudulent loans Trayvon had taken out from the Cayman Islands. They were actively chaining themselves to a sinking ship, and they had just thrown the only key into the ocean. Furthermore, by officially assuming the estate, Isaiah's name was wiped completely clean from the company's future liabilities. My husband's decorated military legacy was permanently safe. The federal fraud was now entirely exclusively on Trayvon's shoulders. The bailiff retrieved the signed documents from the plaintiff's table. He walked them over to the defense table and handed them to Elias. Elias was usually a man of fierce, aggressive action, but right now he was playing the role of the defeated lawyer to absolute perfection. He took the documents with a heavy sigh, projecting a look of weary resignation. But as he reviewed the paperwork, I saw the sharp, lethal focus in his litigator's eyes. He checked every single initial, he verified every signature, he ensured the notarized stamps were perfectly aligned. He turned to me and gave me a slow, silent nod. It was done. The transfer of ownership was absolute binding and completely irrevocable. I was officially free. I no longer owned a single share of the defense contracting firm. My personal assets, my multi-million-dollar life insurance trust, and my private consulting funds were completely insulated from the blast zone. Elias handed the paperwork back to the bailiff, who carried the heavy stack up to the judge's bench. The judge put his reading glasses back on. He meticulously reviewed the signatures on the final page, ensuring that all parties had executed the document correctly. He picked up his own standard black pen. He signed his name on the final order, legally validating the settlement agreement. He handed the file to the court clerk sitting below him. The clerk took a heavy rubber stamp, pressed it into an ink pad, and slammed it down onto the front page. The official seal of the Washington, D.C. Probate Court marked the document. The transaction was officially recognized by the federal government. The judge picked up his wooden gavel. He struck it against the circular sound block on his desk. The sharp, heavy crack echoed like a gunshot through the silent courtroom. Trayvon immediately let out a loud, highly inappropriate breath of relief. He slumped back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, grinning widely at his attorney. Geraldine smiled proudly, sitting up even straighter in her pew. Meredith actually clapped her hands together once before catching herself pulling her hands down to her lap and beaming at the women sitting next to her. They waited for the judge to say the words. They waited for him to announce that court was adjourned. They were ready to stand up, shake hands, and march out of the building to celebrate their massive financial victory at the nearest luxury steakhouse. But the judge did not dismiss the courtroom. He did not announce an adjournment. He slowly took his reading glasses off again, letting them drop to his chest. He closed the thick manila file resting on his desk. He folded his hands together, resting them heavily on top of the closed leather binder. He leaned forward, his gray eyes narrowing sharply. He did not look at me. He did not look at Elias. He looked directly down at Trayvon's high-priced estate attorney. The courtroom grew incredibly still. The low whispers in the gallery instantly evaporated. The sudden shift in the judge's demeanor was terrifyingly palpable. The atmosphere in the room transformed from a simple legal proceeding into something incredibly dangerous. The judge cleared his throat, the sound rough and grating over the microphone. The sharp, grating sound of the judge clearing his throat over the courtroom microphone stopped every single person dead in their tracks. Trayvon had been halfway out of his seat, his hand already reaching over to button his custom suit jacket. Meredith was practically buzzing with excitement, her eyes darting toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the room, ready to make her grand, victorious exit. Geraldine was sitting tall and proud in the front row of the gallery, basking in the envious stares of her high society peers. But the judge did not strike his gavel. He did not dismiss the proceedings. "Counselor, the judge," said, his voice dropping to a low, booming timbre that reverberated off the mahogany walls. "Before I formally adjourn this court, there is a matter of profound financial significance regarding this settlement that requires immediate clarification for the official record." Trayvon's high-priced estate attorney stopped packing his leather briefcase. He looked up at the bench, flashing a polite, entirely unconcerned smile. He clearly thought this was a minor administrative detail, perhaps a routine question about tax routing numbers or filing fees. He stepped back up to the plaintiff's table, radiating the relaxed confidence of a man who had just secured a massive payday. "Yes, Your Honor," the attorney replied smoothly. "My clients are fully prepared to address any final administrative housekeeping. We are eager to begin the transition process and restore the logistics firm to its proper operational status." The judge did not smile back. He looked down at the thick stack of settlement documents, running his hand over the final page, where Trayvon and Geraldine had just eagerly signed away their futures. He looked back up at the attorney, his gray eyes piercing right through the man's arrogant facade. "Counselor?" The judge began, his tone slow and incredibly deliberate. "I have just reviewed the sealed financial addendums submitted by the defense. These addendums were explicitly attached to the indemnity clause your clients just signed. The clause where your clients voluntarily, irrevocably, and unconditionally accepted total legal and financial liability for this estate, exactly as it currently stands." The attorney nodded, still completely oblivious to the trap he was standing in. "That is correct, Your Honor. My clients are fully capitalized. They possess the generational resources and the business acumen required to take over the firm exactly as is. We explicitly waived our right to a prolonged discovery phase during mediation because my clients wished to expedite the transfer of ownership. We are fully aware of the standard operating debts associated with a defense contracting firm of this size." I sat perfectly still next to Elias. I kept my eyes locked on the grain of the wooden table in front of me. I did not want them to see the absolute satisfaction burning in my eyes. Trayvon's lawyer had just admitted on the official court record that they had deliberately skipped reviewing the detailed financial disclosures because they were too greedy and too rushed to seize control of the company. They had been so desperate to lock me out of the empire that they had completely blinded themselves to the reality of the balance sheets. The judge leaned forward. He rested his forearms on the elevated bench, looking down at the plaintiff's table with an expression of sheer judicial disbelief. He took a deep breath, and then he dropped the bomb that would shatter their entire universe. "Counselor," the judge said, his voice ringing with absolute terrifying clarity, Is your client aware that by claiming sole ownership of this estate, she has just assumed sole liability for $15 million in federal tax liens and taken control of an entity currently under active investigation by the FBI? The silence that followed those words was not just quiet. It was a complete breathless vacuum. It felt as if all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the grand courtroom. For 3 agonizing seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then the shockwave hit. The entire courtroom erupted in a collective, deafening gasp. The wealthy gallery members, the self-proclaimed elite of Washington society, who had come to watch my execution, began whispering frantically to one another. The socialites who had been praising Geraldine just moments ago were now pulling physically away from her, leaning back in their wooden pews, as if her sudden toxicity was a contagious disease. At the plaintiff's table, Trevin froze completely. The heavy gold pen he had used to sign the documents slipped from his fingers. It hit the polished mahogany table with a sharp clatter and rolled onto the floor, but he did not even look down. All the blood instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His jaw went slack. He looked around the room with the wide, terrified eyes of a trapped animal, realizing the cage door had just locked shut. Behind him in the gallery, Geraldine let out a sharp, strangled sound. The heavy designer handbag she had been holding slipped from her pristine, gloved hands. It hit the floor, the metal clasp echoing loudly over the rising murmur of the crowd. The perfectly constructed mask of aristocratic superiority she had worn for decades shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She stared at the back of her sons, had her eyes wide with unadulterated horror. She was a woman whose entire identity was built on credit, social standing, and the perception of wealth. In a matter of seconds, she realized that she was not just bankrupt. She was $15 million in debt to the federal government. Meredith was the most pathetic sight of all. Her face turned chalk white. She looked down at the massive diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist, her breathing becoming shallow and erratic. She knew exactly where the money for that jewelry had come from. She knew it was bought with the offshore funds her husband had embezzled. She began shaking her head back and forth rapidly, her perfectly styled blonde hair falling into her eyes as sheer panic took over her body. Trevin's attorney completely lost his composure. The smug, confident smile was wiped from his face, replaced by absolute terror. He knew that allowing his clients to sign a binding assumption of liability for an insolvent, federally investigated shell company was the kind of legal malpractice that ends careers. He scrambled to gather the papers in front of him, his hands trembling violently. He knocked a glass of water over, sending a puddle spreading across the defense table, but he did not care. He looked up at the judge, his voice pitching high with desperation. "Your Honor," the attorney shouted over the noise of the gallery. "Your Honor, there must be a mistake. This is an administrative error. My clients were not informed of any federal investigation. We were told this was a highly profitable logistics firm. We motion to immediately rescind the signatures. We motion to withdraw the settlement agreement on the grounds of fraudulent omission by the defense." Before the judge could even respond, Elias stood up. He did not raise his voice. He did not scramble. He buttoned his suit jacket and projected his voice with the calm, lethal authority of an apex predator closing its jaws. "There was no fraudulent omission. Your Honor," Elias stated clearly. The defense submitted a fully detailed, comprehensive audit of the $15 million offshore liability clearly designated in the sealed manila folder presented during yesterday's mediation. As opposing counsel just stated on the official record, he and his clients explicitly and voluntarily waived their right to review those financial disclosures. They demanded the transfer be expedited. They demanded the estate exactly as it was. They signed a binding indemnity clause against my very strong advice. The judge looked down at Trevin's attorney with absolute disdain. He picked up his wooden gavel. "Counselor, you drafted the forfeiture demands yourself," the judge said coldly. "You brought this settlement to my court. Your clients signed the documents of their own free will right in front of me. This court is not in the business of saving parties from the consequences of their own reckless greed. The signatures are legally binding. The transfer is irrevocable. The motion to rescind is firmly denied." Trevin let out a choked, desperate sound. He grabbed the edge of the table, pulling himself to his feet. He looked wildly between his attorney, the judge, and then finally at me. He opened his mouth to scream, to accuse me of setting him up, to demand that I take the poisoned company back. But he never got the chance to speak. At that exact moment, the heavy oak doors at the very back of the courtroom suddenly swung open with a loud, forceful crash. 2 men and 1 woman strode purposefully down the center aisle of the courtroom. They were not dressed in the high society designer suits that filled the wooden pews around them. They wore dark, functional windbreakers with stark yellow lettering printed aggressively across their backs. FBI, IRS Criminal Investigation Division. The gallery erupted into sheer, unadulterated panic. The self-proclaimed elite of Washington society scrambled to pull their expensive coats and designer handbags out of the way, physically recoiling from the sudden, terrifying presence of federal law enforcement. The sharp, frantic whispers of Geraldine's friends turned into high-pitched gasps of alarm. The agents ignored the wealthy spectators completely. They marched straight past the heavy wooden barricade, their expressions entirely devoid of emotion, holding thick stacks of manila folders and federal warrants. The judge slammed his wooden gavel down repeatedly. The sharp, violent cracks echoed like gunfire through the rising hysteria of the courtroom. He demanded absolute order, his voice booming over the microphone, threatening to have the court bailiffs clear the entire gallery if the spectators did not sit down and remain completely silent. The room instantly froze. The socialites held their breath, terrified of being swept up in whatever massive legal disaster was unfolding right in front of them. The lead federal agent bypassed the plaintiff's table entirely and walked directly to the elevated bench. He handed a heavily sealed folder to the court clerk, who passed it up to the judge. The agent stated clearly for the official court record that they were executing federal arrest and asset seizure warrants. He announced that the warrants were related to massive corporate embezzlement, international wire fraud, and money laundering tied directly to the logistics firm. At the plaintiff's table, Trevon looked like his legs were going to give out beneath him. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning stark white, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The custom-tailored suit he was wearing suddenly looked like a prison uniform. Behind him in the front row, Geraldine was hyperventilating, clutching her chest with her gloved hands as she stared at the federal agents in absolute horror. I did not look at the agents. I did not look at the terrified gallery. I slowly pushed my chair back from the defense table. I stood up perfectly calm and took my time buttoning the center button of my charcoal wool blazer. I stepped out from behind the desk, standing tall and commanding the absolute attention of every single person in the room. The broken, exhausted widow persona was gone. I was the chief financial officer, and I was about to deliver the final audit. I looked directly up at the judge. I asked for permission to clarify the exact nature of the estate for the official court record, noting that the new legal owners of the firm were currently struggling to understand the reality of their recent acquisition. The judge looked up from the federal warrants in his hands. He looked at me, then looked at Trevon, who was trembling visibly at his table. The judge gave me a single grim nod to proceed. I turned my body slowly to face Trevon and Geraldine. My voice was steady, resonant, and completely stripped of any sympathy. I explained to the silent courtroom that my husband Isaiah was a brilliant man. He was a decorated military officer who had built a multi-million-dollar empire on a foundation of absolute honor and intense discipline. I told them that a week before his heart failed him, Isaiah had conducted a private routine audit of the corporate holding accounts. That was the exact moment he found the rotting, toxic core hidden deep beneath the surface of his own life's work. I kept my eyes locked on Trevon as I spoke. I explained that Isaiah discovered his own brother and his own mother had been secretly siphoning millions of dollars from classified government contracts. They had leveraged his pristine reputation, forging his signature, to secure massive unregulated loans from offshore banks in the Cayman Islands. They stole $15 million, I stated clearly, letting the massive number wash over the horrified gallery. I pointed a finger directly at the plaintiff's table. They used that stolen money to buy the custom suits they are wearing right now. They used it to buy the diamonds sitting on Meredith's wrist. They used it to fund every lavish country club gala, every luxury car, and every elite vacation they flaunted across the city. They were financial parasites bleeding a good man dry. I explained that Isaiah knew the profound stress of the betrayal was killing him. He knew his heart was failing. But he also knew that if he confronted them directly while he was sick, Trayvon and Geraldine would launch a hostile legal war. They would have drained the company dry fighting him in court, and they would have dragged his decorated military legacy through the mud just to save themselves. So my husband made a brilliant tactical decision. I told the courtroom that Isaiah spent his final days quietly separating his personal clean wealth into a secure private life insurance trust designed exclusively for me. He insulated my future completely. And then he intentionally left the poisoned, debt-ridden, federally investigated shell company sitting right on the table for his greedy family to fight over. He knew you would try to steal his crown, Trayvon, I said, my voice echoing in the dead silent room. So he left it for you. And I just stepped back and let you put it on. Trayvon completely snapped. The realization that he had been entirely outplayed by his dead brother and the working-class girl he despised completely broke his brain. He started waving his hands frantically, shouting at the federal agents and screaming up at the judge. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his voice pitching high with sheer desperation. He screamed that it was all a lie. He shouted that Isaiah was the one who took out the offshore loans. He claimed Isaiah was the mastermind, the one who physically signed the offshore authorizations to hide money from the government. Trayvon desperately tried to convince the federal agents that I was just a bitter, jealous widow, trying to frame him to cover up my own husband's crimes. He yelled that the signatures on the loan documents clearly said Isaiah's name, proving his brother was the real criminal all along. Elias stood up from the defense table. He did not yell, he did not scramble. He simply opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavily bound forensic report. Elias addressed the court with devastating, lethal calm. He stated that we fully expected the plaintiff to attempt to shift the blame onto the deceased the moment the fraud was exposed. Elias walked the heavy forensic report across the aisle and dropped it directly in front of Trayvon's high-priced, currently hyperventilating estate attorney. The thick document hit the mahogany table with a heavy thud. Elias explained that my husband had not just left me a hard drive full of basic financial ledgers. As a former military logistics commander, Isaiah deeply understood the permanence of digital footprints. The report Elias had just handed over contained the complete, unalterable digital forensics extracted directly from the corporate servers. It included the exact IP addresses, the keystroke logs, and the internal network timestamps for every single offshore loan authorization. Elias looked at Trayvon with absolute, unfiltered disgust. He told the courtroom that the digital logs conclusively proved that the forged electronic signatures were executed directly from Trayvon's private secure terminal. Furthermore, Elias continued, his voice ringing with absolute authority. He pointed out the dates and times of the final 3 massive loan transfers listed on page 40 of the report. You authorized those specific offshore wires on a Tuesday afternoon at precisely 2:00, Elias said, glaring down at Trayvon. We have the certified medical records to prove that at that exact date and time, Isaiah was under heavy sedation at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center receiving an echocardiogram. It is physically, medically, and digitally impossible for Isaiah to have signed those documents. You forged his name while he was in a hospital bed trying to save his own life. Trayvon was completely, undeniably trapped. The walls of his elaborate, arrogant lie collapsed around him in real time. He looked down at the forensic report resting on the table. The undeniable mathematical proof of his federal crimes was sitting right there in black and white. He could not blame his dead brother. He could not blame me. The airtight settlement agreement he had eagerly signed just minutes ago meant he could not even claim he was unaware of the company's financial state. He had absolutely nowhere left to run. The heavy forensic report sat on the mahogany table like an unexploded bomb. Trayvon stared blindly at the digital logs proving his guilt, his chest heaving as the last ounce of his manufactured confidence evaporated. He had no more lies left to tell. He had no more scapegoats to sacrifice. He was completely out of options. The lead FBI agent did not wait for Trayvon to find his voice. He stepped past the wooden barricade dividing the gallery from the court tables. He walked directly up to the plaintiff's table, his posture radiating absolute uncompromising authority. He stated Trevon's full legal name and ordered him to place his hands flat on the table and step away from his attorney. That was the exact moment the illusion of family loyalty completely shattered. There is no honor among thieves, and there is certainly no loyalty among people who only love each other for their proximity to wealth. Meredith was the first one to break. The second the federal agent pulled a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt, Meredith scrambled away from her husband as if he had just caught on fire. She stood up so fast that her heavy wooden chair tipped backward and crashed loudly onto the courtroom floor. She pressed her back against the wooden railing of the gallery, her eyes wide with sheer terror. All of her smug, passive-aggressive elitism vanished in a single heartbeat. Trevon reached a shaking hand out toward her, his voice cracking as he called her name, begging her to call her father's legal team. Meredith did not reach back. Instead, she let out a piercing, hysterical scream. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at her husband's face. "Do not look at me!" Meredith shrieked, her voice echoing wildly through the high ceilings of the courtroom. "I had absolutely nothing to do with this. I did not know anything about any offshore accounts. He lied to me. He told me the logistics firm was paying out his executive bonuses. I am not going to federal prison for you, Trevon." Trevon's jaw dropped. He stared at his wife in absolute betrayal. He reminded her, his voice thick with panic, that she was the one who demanded the custom diamond tennis bracelet she was currently wearing. He reminded her that she had happily spent hundreds of thousands of dollars redecorating their house just last month. Meredith immediately ripped the diamond bracelet off her wrist, as if the stones were burning her skin. She threw the heavy platinum jewelry directly onto the plaintiff's table. It hit the wood with a sharp, heavy clatter. She looked frantically at the federal agents, loudly demanding her own legal counsel, completely abandoning the man she had just sworn to build a new empire with. She was perfectly happy to play the role of the arrogant, elite wife when the money was flowing. But the second the consequences arrived, she threw her husband under the bus without a single second of hesitation. While Meredith was having her public meltdown, the female agent from the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division calmly walked around the table and approached the front row of the gallery. She stopped directly in front of Geraldine. Geraldine was sitting frozen in her wooden pew. Her immaculate navy designer suit suddenly looked far too big for her. The aristocratic posture she had maintained for decades was completely gone. She looked like a hollow, terrified shell of a woman. The IRS agent did not raise her voice. She simply handed Geraldine a thick stack of federal documents stamped with bright red seals. The agent explained for the official court record that since Geraldine had just voluntarily signed an irrevocable settlement, claiming 50% ownership of the logistics firm and its liabilities, she was now personally responsible for the massive federal tax liens attached to the offshore fraud. The agent stated that the Internal Revenue Service was executing immediate asset seizure protocols to recover the $15 million stolen from the federal government. I watched Geraldine's eyes scan the bold print on the asset seizure notices. I watched the exact moment the devastating reality of the math hit her brain. She had signed the total forfeiture agreement because she wanted to leave me with absolutely nothing. She had been so blinded by her hatred for me, so desperate to strip a working-class girl of her wealth, that she had eagerly claimed ownership of a massive federal debt. The IRS notices listed every single thing she was about to lose. Her historic multi-million-dollar mansion in Georgetown was slated for immediate foreclosure. Her luxury Mercedes was going to be impounded. The private bank accounts she had spent a lifetime padding were officially frozen. Even her prestigious country club shares, the ultimate symbol of her high society status, were being seized by the federal government. Geraldine let out a low, agonizing gasp. Her legs gave out completely. She collapsed back into her wooden chair, her hands trembling violently as the federal documents slipped from her fingers and scattered across the courtroom floor. She was struggling to breathe, her chest heaving as a full-blown panic attack overtook her. She looked around desperately for help. She turned to the packed gallery behind her, seeking comfort from the high society friends she had invited to witness my execution. But the elite circles of Washington, D.C. are notoriously ruthless. They do not associate with federal criminals, and they certainly do not associate with bankrupt socialites. The wealthy politicians' wives, the country club board members, and the elite investors were actively pulling away from her. They were whispering frantically to one another, gathering their expensive coats and designer handbags, and hurrying toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom. They avoided making any eye contact with Geraldine. They looked at her with pure, unfiltered disgust. She was no longer the matriarch of their social circle. She was a toxic, ruined woman, and they were fleeing the room to ensure their own reputations were not tainted by her massive public downfall. At the plaintiff's table, the lead FBI agent grabbed Trayvon's arms and pulled them behind his back. The sharp, cold metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the room. Trayvon lost whatever was left of his arrogant alpha male persona. He broke down completely. He started sobbing loudly, his tears ruining his expensive collar, as the federal agent read him his Miranda rights. He begged his high-priced estate attorney to do something to file an injunction to make a deal. The attorney slowly zipped his leather briefcase shut. He looked at Trayvon with absolute professional detachment. He stated clearly that he was retained to handle a probate dispute, not a federal criminal fraud indictment. He informed Trayvon that since he had lied during mediation and hidden an active federal investigation from his own legal counsel, their attorney-client relationship was officially terminated. The lawyer turned his back on Trayvon and walked out of the courtroom without a single backward glance. The federal agents began escorting Trayvon down the center aisle. His legs dragged heavily against the floor, his entire body shaking as he realized he was going to spend the best years of his life in a federal penitentiary. As they walked past the front row of the gallery, Geraldine suddenly lunged forward. She fell to her knees right at the edge of the wooden barricade. Her immaculate hair was disheveled. The expensive makeup she had applied so carefully that morning was running down her face in dark, ruined streaks. She had lost her son, her fortune, her home, and her pride in less than 10 minutes. She did not reach out to the federal agents. She did not reach out to the judge. Geraldine reached her shaking hands directly out to me. I was standing quietly beside the defense table watching the absolute destruction of the people who had tried to erase my existence. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I stood tall, representing the strength and the integrity of the man they had betrayed. Geraldine looked up at me, tears pouring down her cheeks. Her voice was a broken, desperate sob. "Camille, please!" Geraldine begged, her hands reaching out across the aisle. "Camille, you have to help us. You have the clean money. You have the private trust Isaiah left you. You can pay the lawyers. You can talk to the judge. Please, I am begging you. We are family. You cannot just let them take everything. We are your family." The sheer audacity of her plea hung heavily in the air. After years of treating me like dirt, after kicking me out of my own home, after throwing my hard-earned college degree into a garbage bag, and after demanding I hand over my husband's watch, while his body was barely cold, she was now on her knees, desperately using the word family to try and save herself from a prison of her own making. The sheer audacity of her plea hung heavily in the sterile air of the courtroom. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman kneeling on the hardwood floor just inches away from the defense table. Geraldine was gasping for air, her chest heaving under her expensive designer suit, her hands trembling as she reached across the wooden barricade toward me. She was desperately using the word family as a shield, hoping it would somehow protect her from the devastating reality of the federal prison sentence and the absolute financial ruin she had just brought upon herself. I looked at her ruined face, watching the expensive cosmetics run down her cheeks in dark, messy streaks. I thought about the staggering hypocrisy of her desperation. This was the exact same woman who had dropped a velvet-lined box onto my dining table and demanded my dead husband's watch while his body was barely cold. This was the woman who had proudly commanded a team of movers to throw my Howard University diploma into a cardboard box and pack my clothes into black plastic garbage bags. She had spent the last 7 years treating me like an uninvited pest, constantly reminding me that my working-class background made me an absolute embarrassment to her elite Washington social circles. She had tried to strip me of my dignity, my home, and my financial security without a single ounce of hesitation. And now the moment the federal government was stepping in to seize her mansion and her luxury cars, she suddenly wanted to pretend we shared a sacred bond. I did not raise my voice. I did not bend down to meet her at her level. I kept my posture perfectly straight, radiating the absolute authority and unbothered grace that she had always tried to crush out of me. "You do not get to use the word family, Geraldine," I said, my voice echoing clearly over the frantic murmurs of the fleeing gallery. "You stopped being family the moment you forged Isaiah's signature while he was fighting for his life in a hospital bed. You stopped being family when you decided your country club memberships were more important than your own son's legacy." Geraldine let out a loud, pathetic sob. She grabbed the edge of the wooden barricade, her knuckles turning white as she tried to pull herself up. She begged me again, crying that she had made a mistake, claiming she was just trying to protect the logistics firm and keep the estate intact. She pleaded with me to use my private consulting funds to hire a defense team for her and Trayvon, swearing that she would pay me back every single cent once the misunderstanding with the Internal Revenue Service was cleared up. She still did not understand. She was still trying to manipulate reality to fit her delusion. "There is no misunderstanding," I stated coldly, looking her dead in the eyes. "And there is no coming back from this. I offered you a total forfeiture settlement, and you eagerly signed your name on the dotted line. You demanded total ownership of the empire. You wanted every single thing Isaiah left behind." I leaned forward just slightly, delivering the final lethal blow to her crumbling ego. "Enjoy it," I whispered. I turned my back on her. I did not wait for her response. I did not care to listen to the frantic, begging cries that erupted from her throat as the realization of her absolute doom finally cemented itself in her mind. I began walking down the center aisle of the courtroom, my heels clicking sharply against the polished floor with a steady rhythmic cadence. The scene unfolding around me was a masterpiece of poetic justice. The federal agents were actively pulling Trayvon up from his chair. The harsh metallic rattle of the steel handcuffs securing his wrists provided a beautiful soundtrack to my exit. Trayvon was completely broken, sobbing loudly like a terrified child. His custom-tailored suit rumpled and useless as the agents read him his Miranda rights. He was going to spend the absolute best years of his life in a federal penitentiary, completely stripped of the wealth and the false status he had murdered his brother's reputation to maintain. As I walked past the front row of the gallery, I locked eyes with Meredith. She was backed into the corner of the wooden pew, her face completely pale, her chest rising and falling in rapid, terrified breaths. She had thrown her stolen diamond bracelet onto the table and was currently screaming into her cell phone, frantically demanding that her father's legal team send an attorney to the courthouse immediately to separate her assets from Trayvon's. When she saw me walking past, she dropped the phone from her ear. She reached a shaking hand out toward me, her eyes wide with sheer panic. "Camille, please," Meredith stammered, her voice cracking under the weight of her terror. "You have to tell them I did not know anything about the offshore accounts. You have to tell the agents I was not involved in the fraud. We are sisters-in-law, Camille. I never wanted them to forge the will." I did not stop walking. I did not break my stride for a single fraction of a second. I looked at Meredith, the woman who had purposely spilled red wine on my dress, the woman who had mocked my education and told me to go back to my old neighborhood. I looked at her with pure, unfiltered indifference. I did not give her a smile. I did not give her a scowl. I gave her absolutely nothing. To a narcissist whose entire life revolves around seeking attention and projecting superiority, absolute silence is the most devastating weapon you can deploy. I let my eyes slide right past her, as if she were completely invisible, leaving her standing there to face the federal consequences of the stolen wealth she had so happily spent. Elias caught up with me just as I reached the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom. He walked beside me, his posture relaxed and victorious. The fierce, aggressive litigator had executed the trap flawlessly, and he was currently basking in the aftermath of a perfectly fought war. We pushed through those heavy doors and stepped out into the quiet, marble-lined corridor of the courthouse. The frantic shouting and the chaos of the federal arrests were immediately muffled behind the thick wood. The sudden silence in the hallway felt incredibly peaceful. Elias stopped walking and turned to face me. He reached into his slim leather briefcase and pulled out a crisp, heavy manila envelope. He held it out to me with both hands, a gesture of profound professional respect. I took the envelope and unhooked the metal clasp. Inside was a stack of immaculate, freshly stamped legal documents. It was the finalized paperwork for the multi-million-dollar life insurance trust and the private stock portfolio Isaiah had established exclusively in my name. Elias looked at me, a genuine smile softening the sharp edges of his face. He told me that the trust was entirely insulated from the logistics firm. He confirmed that the federal government had already reviewed the separation of assets and cleared my accounts completely. The money inside those documents was perfectly clean, completely untraceable to the offshore fraud, and absolutely untouchable by any creditor lawyer or family member. "Your husband was a brilliant tactician," Camille Elias said softly, nodding down at the documents in my hands. "He knew exactly what he was doing. He protected you perfectly." I looked down at the crisp white paper, my vision blurring slightly with a fresh wave of tears. But these were not the tears of a broken, defeated widow. They were tears of profound, overwhelming gratitude. Isaiah had loved me with a fierce, protective intensity that transcended his own mortality. He had seen the incoming threat, and he had built an impenetrable fortress around me before his heart finally gave out. He had given me the ultimate gift of freedom. I thanked Elias for his incredible work. I told him I would be transferring his final retainer fee by the end of the day, plus a very generous bonus for dealing with my incredibly toxic in-laws. Elias chuckled, shook my hand warmly, and turned to head back into the courtroom to observe the rest of the federal asset seizure. I clutched the heavy envelope to my chest and walked down the long corridor toward the main exit. I pushed through the rotating glass doors and stepped out onto the grand stone portico of the Washington, D.C. courthouse. The bright midday sunlight washed over me, instantly chasing away the cold, sterile air of the legal halls. The sky was a brilliant, endless blue. The crisp breeze blowing off the Potomac River ruffled the edges of my blazer. I stood at the top of the marble steps looking out over the bustling city. The traffic flowed smoothly, the pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks, and the world continued spinning forward. I took a deep cleansing breath, filling my lungs with the fresh air of absolute freedom. I was 35 years old. I was completely unburdened by toxic family dynamics. I was financially secure beyond my wildest dreams. I was untouchable. I looked up at the bright sky, a genuine radiant smile breaking across my face. I thought about Isaiah's brilliant final maneuver. He had taught me the ultimate lesson in strategy and survival. Trayvon and Geraldine had been so obsessed with claiming power and status that they had destroyed their own lives trying to steal something that was already rotten. They thought wealth was about accumulating titles, luxury cars, and massive corporate bank accounts. But as I walked down the marble steps and into the bright sunlight to begin the rest of my beautiful life, I finally understood the truth. True wealth is not about what you greedily take from others. It is about knowing exactly what to leave behind. If you have ever had to outsmart toxic family members to protect your own peace and your own future, share your story in the comments below. Let me know how you found the strength to walk away from people who tried to break you. Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about resilient strategy and ultimate justice. Remember that your worth is never defined by the people who cannot see it, and sometimes the quietest moves lead to the loudest victories. Thank you for listening to my journey today. The greatest lesson I learned from my husband's death and my in-laws' betrayal is that true power lies in absolute silence. When toxic people are blinded by their own greed, you do not need to fight them for control. You just need to step back and let their arrogance destroy them. Geraldine and Trayvon were so obsessed with stealing my empire that they never stopped to check if the crown was poisoned. I walked away with my peace, my dignity, and my real wealth perfectly intact. Sometimes the most beautiful victory is simply letting your enemies defeat themselves completely. If you have ever walked away from a toxic family to protect your own peace, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of ultimate justice.